June 11th, 1864. The midday sun hammered down on the high plains of the Colorado Territory, baking the soil into a cracked, unyielding hardpan that radiated heat through the soles of boots and the hooves of horses. 25 miles southeast of the settlement of Denver, the air around the Hungate Ranch did not smell of sagebrush or dry grass, but of iron and rot. A neighbor, Van Wormer, rode his horse toward the cabin, expecting the mundane sounds of a working homestead, the clatter of a bucket or the lowing of cattle. Instead, the silence was total, heavy, and broken only by the frantic buzzing vibration of blowflies that had gathered in black clouds near the doorway. The front door stood wide open, swinging slightly in the hot wind. Van Wormer dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grit. He walked toward the house and found the body of Nathaniel Hungate. The rancher lay in the dirt, twisted in the final spasms of a violent death. His skin was pale where it was not stained with dried, blackening blood. Several arrows protruded from his torso, the shafts still feathered and stiff. The violence inflicted upon him went beyond the necessity of killing. His scalp had been torn from his skull, leaving a raw, red circle of exposed bone and muscle that the flies were already consuming. The brutality of the cut suggested a dull blade and a heavy hand. Van Wormer moved past Nathaniel, the bile rising in his throat, and looked for the family. He found Ellen Hungate near the house. Her body was a road map of torture. She had been stabbed repeatedly, the wounds gaping open to the dry air. The attackers had violated her, leaving her clothing torn and her body positioned in a way that stripped her of dignity even in death. Like her husband, her hair was gone, taken as a trophy. But the sight that dropped Van Wormer to his knees lay in the grass nearby. The two children, Laura and Florence, were dead. Laura was 2.5 years old. Florence was an infant. Their small bodies were butchered. Their throats had been slashed with such force that the heads were nearly severed from the trunks, held on only by the spinal cords and strips of flesh. The blood had soaked into the earth, turning the dust into a dark, congealed mud beneath them. The neighbor did not have time to mourn or process the horror. The fear of the attackers returning or still being watched from the ridgelines forced him into action. He loaded the 4 bodies into a wagon. The stiffening limbs of the family were piled onto the rough wood planks. The heat of the day was relentless, accelerating the decomposition process. The smell of death, heavy and sweet, rose from the wagon bed as Van Wormer whipped the horses into a panic, driving them hard toward Denver. The 25-mile journey was a grueling race against his own terror. The wagon bounced over ruts and rocks, jostling the corpses, the dead weight thumping against the wood. Dust coated the bloody clothing of the Hungate family, mixing with the fluids leaking from their wounds. When the wagon rattled into the streets of Denver, the sun was still high. Van Wormer did not take the bodies to an undertaker. He drove them directly to the center of the town. The arrival of the wagon acted like a signal fire. People poured out of the saloons, the general stores, and the hotels. They crowded around the wagon, pressing in to see what had been brought from the plains. The reaction was immediate. Men retched into the dirt. Women screamed and covered their faces, but then looked again. The sheer graphic nature of the violence was unlike anything the city dwellers had seen. This was not a rumor of war. It was the physical evidence of it, rotting in the sun before their eyes. The bodies were laid out on public display. A coroner's jury was hastily convened, but the true purpose was to incite the population. The citizens of Denver filed past the corpses. They looked at the severed necks of the toddlers. They stared at the exposed skulls of the parents. The image of the white bone against the dark blood seared itself into the collective memory of the settlement. The abstract fear of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, which had been simmering for months due to stolen cattle and disrupted mail, instantly hardened into a concrete, murderous rage. The dialogue in the street shifted from concern to a demand for extermination. There was no discussion of which specific band had committed the act, or whether it was the work of a rogue party. The blame was cast instantly upon all natives. Panic swept through the city with the speed of a prairie fire. The rumor mill began to churn out terrifying narratives. Men claimed that an army of thousands of warriors was gathering just outside the city limits, ready to burn Denver to the ground and butcher every inhabitant just as they had the Hun gates. Shopkeepers stopped selling goods and started boarding up their windows with heavy timber. The sound of hammers driving nails echoed through the streets, a chaotic rhythm of preparation. Families living on the outskirts, on isolated homesteads like the Hun gates, threw their possessions into wagons and fled into the city center. They camped in the streets, in the lobbies of buildings, and in empty lots, believing that safety lay in numbers. The population of Denver swelled with refugees from the surrounding countryside, all of them armed, all of them terrified. Governor John Evans watched the city descend into hysteria. He was a man under immense pressure. The Civil War in the East was consuming all the resources of the federal government. The Union Army had stripped the Colorado Territory of its regular troops, leaving only a skeleton crew to patrol a vast, hostile wilderness. The Overland Trail, the only artery for mail and supplies, was being cut repeatedly. Food prices were rising. The mail was weeks late. Now, with the Hun gate bodies on display, the citizens were looking to him for action. Evans knew he could not wait for help from Washington. He had to use the fear to his advantage. He needed to mobilize the population itself. Evans met with his military advisors, including Colonel John Chivington. Chivington was a massive man, a former preacher with a booming voice and a belief in the righteous application of force. He had led the charge at Glorieta Pass, stopping a Confederate invasion, and he was hungry for another victory. Together they looked at the map of the territory. It was a vast emptiness dotted with mining camps and ranches, all of them vulnerable. They decided that since they could not defend every home, they would go on the offensive. But first they needed a legal framework to justify the killing that was about to commence. On June 27, 1864, Governor Evans sat at his desk and drafted a proclamation that would change the rules of engagement on the plains. The document was titled, "To the Friendly Indians of the Iowa Plains," but the text was a declaration of war. Evans wrote that in consequence of the war being waged by hostile Indians, it was impossible for the civil and military authorities to distinguish the friendly from the hostile. He laid out a specific ultimatum. He ordered all friendly Indians to separate themselves from the hostiles and go to designated places of safety. The Arapaho and Cheyenne of the Arkansas River were told to go to Fort Lyon and report to the military commander there. They were promised provisions and safety. However, the crucial part of the proclamation was the warning to those who did not comply. Evans wrote that the object of this was to prevent friendly Indians from being killed through mistake. The logic was binary and lethal. If a native was at the fort, they were friendly. If they were anywhere else on the plains, they were hostile and could be killed. Evans knew as he wrote it that the means of distributing this message were almost non-existent. There were no runners sent to the various bands. There was no effort to translate the document into the native tongues and ensure the chiefs understood the terms. The proclamation was printed in English in the Rocky Mountain News. It was tacked up on walls in mining camps. It was read by white settlers, not by the tribes it was addressed to. It served as a permission slip for the white population. The panic in Denver did not subside with the proclamation. It intensified. Every dust devil spinning on the horizon was interpreted as a war party. Every shadow at night was a scout. To calm the populace and harness their energy, the authorities ordered the construction of defenses. The citizens of Denver were told to dig. Men of all stations, lawyers, miners, bartenders, and clerks took up shovels and picks. They marched to the outskirts of the town and began to carve trenches into the hard earth. The labor was grueling. The ground was dry and rocky. The men sweated through their shirts, their hands blistering as they hacked at the soil. They dug a perimeter, throwing the dirt up to create breastworks. They created firing positions, angling the lines of the trenches to create crossfire zones. It was a massive expenditure of energy driven entirely by the image of the Hungate children. They worked through the day and into the night, working by the light of lanterns. The city transformed into an armed camp. The regular business of the territory halted. Gold shipments sat in vaults. The focus was entirely on survival. During this time, Governor Evans took a step that further eroded the line between soldier and civilian. He issued a circular authorizing the citizens of Colorado to organize into militia companies. He told them to arm themselves. He gave them explicit permission to kill any Indian found stealing livestock and to take the property back. This authorization removed the need for due process or military oversight. It effectively told every rancher that he was now a judge and executioner. A man could shoot a native on sight and claim he was defending his property, and the law would support him. This circular circulated widely, finding its way into every saddlebag and holster in the territory. It legitimized the hatred that had sprung from the Hungate massacre. The atmosphere in Denver became toxic. In the saloons, men drank whiskey and bragged about what they would do when they found the Indians. They inspected their weapons constantly. Revolvers were disassembled, oiled, and reassembled. Rifles were checked for rust, the smell of gun oil mixed with the stale tobacco smoke. The talk was not of treaties or peace commissions. It was of scalps. The white settlers began to speak of the natives as animals, using the language of pest control rather than warfare. They dehumanized the enemy to the point where the killing of a child could be justified as the elimination of a future threat. As June turned to July, the heat intensified, and so did the frustration. The great invasion never came. The trenches stood empty, filling with tumbleweeds. The skyline remained clear of the massed warrior armies the rumors had promised. This absence of an attack did not relieve the tension. It aggravated it. The citizens felt they were being stalked by an invisible enemy. They felt powerless. They wanted to strike back, but there was no one to strike. The natives were out on the vast plains, moving with the buffalo, elusive and distant. Governor Evans sent frantic telegrams to Washington, D.C. He described a territory on the brink of collapse. He exaggerated the numbers of the hostile forces, claiming that the Sioux, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho were forming a massive alliance to cut off the West from the Union. He pleaded for permission to raise a special regiment. He argued that the standing force, the 1st Colorado Cavalry, was too scattered to be effective. They were pinned down in small detachments at stage stations, guarding hay supplies and horses. They could not mount a campaign. Evans wanted a force that was mobile, aggressive, and dedicated solely to the Indian problem. The War Department was reluctant. General Curtis, commanding the Department of Kansas, was skeptical of Evans' reports. He saw them as political maneuvering. But the persistence of the governor, fueled by the genuine terror of his constituents, eventually wore down the resistance. The groundwork was being laid for the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. Meanwhile, the bodies of the Hungate family were finally buried, but they were not forgotten. The image of them remained the primary psychological driver of the territory. Every time a rider came into town with a report of a skirmish or a stolen horse, the memory of the mutilated bodies was invoked. It became the standard by which all interactions were measured. If the Indians could do that to a family, then the white settlers were justified in doing anything in return. The moral compass of the territory had been smashed. In the governor's office, the maps on the wall became the focus of daily strategy sessions. Evans and Chivington looked at the vast spaces between the rivers. They identified the likely camping spots of the tribes. They plotted the distances. They were not planning a defense anymore, they were planning a hunt. They needed to find the bands regardless of which specific individuals were responsible for the Hungate murders. In their minds, the tribes were a collective entity and the punishment had to be collective. The isolation of Denver contributed to the paranoia. The telegraph lines were frequently cut by raiding parties, severing the connection to the east for days at a time. When the lines were down, the city felt adrift in a hostile ocean. Rumors filled the void of information. People said that the water supplies were being poisoned. They said that spies were in the city. This siege mentality created a bonding effect among the settlers. They were in this together against a savage world. The unity was built on fear and a shared desire for violence. By late summer, the soil of the trenches had hardened like concrete. The citizens kept their rifles loaded by their beds. The children played games of soldiers and Indians in the dusty streets. The normalcy of life had been replaced by a permanent state of alert. The proclamation of June 27th remained in effect, a standing order that categorized human beings by their geographic location. If a Cheyenne family was hunting buffalo on the Republican River, they were technically at war with the United States, whether they knew it or not. The stage was set. The justification had been established. The population was radicalized. The leadership was committed to a military solution. The only thing missing was the instrument of destruction. The waiting game was wearing thin. The men of Colorado were tired of digging ditches and waiting for an enemy that struck in the dark and vanished. They wanted to ride out and bring the war to the camps. They wanted to inflict the same horror they had seen in the wagon bed on that June afternoon. The sun set on the mountains, casting long shadows over the plains, a prelude to the darkness that was gathering in the hearts of the men who watched the horizon. August 11th, 1864. The telegraph key in the Denver office clicked out a message that Governor John Evans had been waiting for with a desperate impatience. The wire came from the War Department in Washington, D.C., finally authorizing the recruitment of a regiment of volunteers to serve for a period of 100 days. This specific time frame was the defining characteristic of the new unit. It was not a commitment for the duration of the Civil War, nor was it a long-term enlistment that would drag men away from their families and businesses for years. It was a short, sharp contract designed for a singular purpose: to fight Indians. The federal government, stretched thin by the massive campaigns against the Confederacy in the East, had conceded to Evans' request to raise a force that would operate independently of the regular army structure. The news hit the streets of Denver like a shot of whiskey. Recruitment posters were printed immediately, the ink barely dry, before they were slapped onto the walls of saloons, livery stables, and general stores. The call to arms was direct. It appealed to the anger that had been festering since the display of the Hungate bodies 2 months prior. It offered a chance for retribution. The pay was standard Army wages, $16 a month, but the real draw was the opportunity to strike back at the invisible enemy that had been terrorizing the territory. The term 100 days implied a sprint, a season of violence that would be over before the deep snows of winter set in. Men began to line up at the recruiting stations. The demographics of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry were distinct from the regular Army units. These were not career soldiers or disciplined patriots looking to save the Union. They were miners who had found the creeks dry or the veins played out. They were teamsters whose wagons were parked due to the raids on the trails. They were drifters, laborers, and saloon regulars who saw a chance for steady food and a government-issued horse. The ranks filled with a rough element of the frontier society, men who were accustomed to settling disputes with fists or knives now being handed military authority. The officers appointed to command them were often political appointees or men with local influence rather than tactical brilliance. They were friends of Governor Evans or Colonel Chivington. The structure of the regiment mirrored the social hierarchy of the mining camps in the Denver business district. The discipline was loose from the start. Salutes were casual if they happened at all. The men addressed their superiors by their first names. The rigid hierarchy of the United States Army was replaced by a posse mentality, formalized only by the distribution of blue uniforms. Camp Weld, located on the outskirts of Denver near the Platte River, became the staging ground for this new force. The conditions were chaotic. The supply lines from the east were still choked off by the very raids the regiment was being built to stop, so equipment was scarce. Men drilled in their civilian clothes while waiting for uniforms. Some rode their own horses, animals that were bony and overworked, while others waited for government mounts that arrived in slow, sporadic shipments. Weapons were a mix of outdated muskets, personal revolvers, and whatever carbines the territory could scrounge from the armories. The training regimen was minimal. There was no time to teach complex maneuvers or the subtleties of cavalry tactics. The focus was on riding in formation and shooting. The parade ground at Camp Weld became a dust bowl churned up by the hooves of hundreds of horses as the raw recruits attempted to learn the bugle calls. The air was thick with profanity and the smell of unwashed bodies. In the evenings, the discipline evaporated entirely. Whiskey flowed freely through the tents. Fights broke out over card games or perceived insults. The officers often turned a blind eye or joined in the drinking. This was not a force being honed for a strategic campaign. It was a mob being given a shape. Colonel John Chivington took a personal interest in the 3rd. He saw them as his instrument. He visited the camp frequently, his massive frame dominating the gatherings. He spoke to the men not of military honor but of vengeance. He stoked the hatred that had brought them to the recruiting table. He told them that their mission was to kill Indians. He did not make distinctions between tribes or bands. He did not speak of treaties. He spoke of extermination. His rhetoric validated the darkest impulses of the volunteers. He assured them that the government supported them, that the citizens of Denver supported them, and that their brutality would be rewarded. As the weeks of August and September ground on, the regiment earned a nickname from the veterans of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and the citizens of Denver. They were called the Bloodless 3rd. The name was a jab at their lack of combat experience. While the 1st had been fighting in New Mexico and guarding the trails for years, the 3rd was sitting at Camp Weld, eating government rations and drinking in the local bars. The nickname stung the pride of the volunteers. It created a pressure within the ranks to prove themselves. They wanted to shed the label. They wanted blood to wash it away. They became eager for a fight, any fight, to validate their existence as soldiers. The atmosphere in Denver during this mobilization was surreal. The city was under martial law. The provost guard patrolled the streets, enforcing curfews and regulating the sale of goods. The economy was strangled. Prices for flour, sugar, and coffee skyrocketed as the wagon trains from the east ceased to arrive. The isolation felt absolute. The recruitment of the 3rd was seen as the only way to break the siege. The citizens watched the drilling at Camp Weld with a mix of hope and anxiety. They needed this regiment to be effective. They invested their emotional energy into these rough men, viewing them as the saviors of the territory. Governor Evans was fighting his own battle on the political front. He knew that the authorization for the 3rd was temporary. The 100-day clock began ticking the moment a man was mustered in. The enlistments would expire in late autumn. If the regiment did not achieve a decisive victory before then, the money and the effort would be wasted. Evans would look incompetent in the eyes of Washington. His bid for statehood would fail. He needed a result. This deadline created a strategic urgency that ignored the realities of the season or the location of the hostile bands. The Third had to fight someone somewhere before their time ran out. The logistics of equipping the regiment continued to plague the operation. Horses were the biggest problem. A cavalry unit without horses was useless on the vast plains. Agents were sent out to buy, rent, or confiscate animals from the surrounding ranches. Many of the horses procured were unbroken or too old for the rigors of a campaign. The men spent hours in the corrals trying to break wild mustangs, often resulting in injuries before they ever saw an enemy. The medical tents filled with men nursing broken arms and kicked ribs. This added to the frustration and the general foul mood of the camp. Ammunition was another shortage. The men could not practice marksmanship as much as was needed because every cartridge was precious. They drilled with empty weapons, shouting bang or snapping the hammers on empty chambers. This lack of live fire practice meant that while the men were eager to shoot, many of them were poor shots. They compensated for this lack of skill with a surplus of aggression. They sharpened their knives and traded stories about how they would scalp their enemies, mimicking the mutilations they had heard about or seen on the Hungate bodies. The relationship between the Third and the merchants of Denver had deteriorated into a tense standoff before the departure. The soldiers, unpaid and often unfed due to logistical failures, had taken to requisitioning goods on their own authority. A group of volunteers would enter a dry goods store, their boots heavy on the floorboards, and simply take boots, blankets, or tobacco. The shopkeepers, knowing the governor and Chivington backed these men, had little recourse. They watched their inventory disappear, adding the cost to the mental tally of the war's expense. This friction added a layer of resentment to the city's atmosphere. The citizens wanted the soldiers gone, not just to fight the Indians, but to stop eating the town out of house and home. The departure of the Third was as much an eviction as it was a deployment. The weaponry of the Third deserves closer inspection to understand the violence they would later inflict. While some men carried the standard-issue Star carbines, which were reliable enough, many were armed with Austrian muskets, heavy and obsolete weapons that fired a large, slow projectile. These guns were notorious for their violent recoil and inaccuracy at range. However, at close quarters they were devastating. The large caliber balls smashed bone and tore massive wound channels. The men also carried an array of personal sidearms, Colt Navy revolvers, Remington percussions, and even single-shot horse pistols. They carried Bowie knives, skinning knives, and hatchets tucked into their belts. The lack of uniformity meant that the supply wagons had to carry a dozen different types of ammunition, a logistical nightmare that further complicated their movement. The officers of the Third were a study in ambition and incompetence. Many had secured their commissions through political favors. They were men who sought the title of captain or lieutenant for the social standing it would provide in the post-war territory. They viewed the campaign as a stepping stone to political office. Their orders were often contradictory or vague. They argued amongst themselves about routes and campsites. The enlisted men, sensing this lack of genuine leadership, obeyed orders when it suited them, or when the threat of punishment was immediate. The bond between officer and enlisted man was not one of respect, but of shared vice and shared hatred. They drank together, cursed the government together, and plotted their revenge together. As the column moved further from Denver, the landscape changed. The comfort of the city was replaced by the stark reality of the high plains. The water became scarce and alkaline, twisting the guts of men and horses alike. Dysentery swept through the ranks, weakening the force. Men rode slumped in their saddles, pale and sweating, cursing the day they signed the paper. The horses, already weak, began to die. The trail of the Third was marked by the carcasses of animals left to rot or be eaten by wolves. This attrition hardened the survivors. It stripped away any lingering romantic notions of a cavalry charge. They learned to sleep on the rocky ground, to eat food that was half sand, and to endure the constant, maddening wind. The interaction with the 1st Colorado Cavalry, particularly the veterans stationed at the outposts they passed, was filled with friction. The veterans looked at the 100 Dazers with open disdain. They saw the lack of discipline, the poor horsemanship, and the loud, boastful behavior as a liability. Arguments broke out at the sutler stores where the units crossed paths. The men of the 1st called the 3rd holiday soldiers and Indian eaters, mocking their bloodlust which had yet to be tested. The 3rd responded with aggression, eager to show the veterans that they were the ones who would finally finish the job. This inter-unit rivalry pushed the 3rd to be even more extreme in their rhetoric. They felt they had to outdo the regulars in violence to prove their worth. Governor Evans, back in Denver, monitored the progress of the regiment via the sporadic reports that came back. He was managing a delicate situation with Washington. The federal authorities were beginning to ask questions about the necessity of the 3rd and the expenses being incurred. Evans had to constantly justify the regiment's existence. He painted a picture of a territory under constant assault, suppressing information about the lack of actual large-scale attacks during the late summer. He needed the war to be real to justify the regiment, and he needed the regiment to fight to justify the war. It was a circular logic that required a climax. The weather during the march south began to hint at the coming winter. Frost coated the buffalo grass in the mornings. The men, many without proper winter coats, shivered in their saddles. They wrapped themselves in blankets, looking more like a refugee column than a military unit. The cold made tempers short. Fights over firewood were common. The officers had to intervene to prevent men from shooting each other over a warm spot near the fire. This misery was directed outward. The men blamed the Indians for their suffering. If it weren't for the Indians, they would be back in the warmth of a saloon or a boarding house. Every frozen toe and shivering night added to the debt they intended to collect. Chivington's influence remained the guiding force. Although he was not with the column every step of the way, his orders and his presence loomed over the operation. He sent dispatches urging speed and aggression. He reminded the commanders that the time was short. He wanted results. He wanted the regiment positioned to strike the moment the location of the camps was confirmed. He was positioning chess pieces for a game where the rules were simply to wipe the board clean. By the time the 3rd Colorado Cavalry reached the area of operation near the Arkansas River, the transformation was complete. The shopkeepers and laborers had been forged by hardship, propaganda, and peer pressure into a weapon of mass murder. They were dirty, hungry, sick, and angry. They were armed to the teeth and led by men who demanded a massacre. The bloodless 3rd was no longer a joke. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. The 100-day clock had ticked down significantly, leaving them with a narrow window to act. The desperation to kill was palpable. It vibrated through the ranks like a fever. They looked out at the snow-dusted plains, searching for the teepees, searching for the people who would pay for the Hungate family, for the bad food, for the cold nights, and for the fear that had ruled their lives for months. As October bled into November, the pressure on the regiment to produce a body count became the primary driver of their daily existence. The men were not patrolling to secure the peace. They were hunting to justify their paychecks and their egos. The column moved like a dark stain across the prairie, the iron of their horseshoes striking sparks against the flinty ground. The laughter and the songs that had characterized the early days at Camp Weld had been replaced by a grim silence, broken only by the coughs of sick men and the snap of leather whips. They were a coiled spring wound tight by months of rhetoric and discomfort. The object of their release did not matter as much as the release itself. They needed to fire their weapons. They needed to see an enemy fall. The bloodless 3rd was ready to earn its name, not by courage, but by slaughter. September 28, 1864. The heavy wheels of the transport wagons ground against the gravel of the road leading into Denver, carrying a delegation that represented the last fragile hope for peace on the high plains. Inside the wagons sat 7 chiefs of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, including Black Kettle of the Cheyenne and White Antelope, along with Bull Bear, Neva, and others who held the weight of their people's survival on their shoulders. They had traveled hundreds of miles under the escort of Major Edward Wynkoop, the commander of Fort Lyon who had gambled his career to bring them here. The destination was Camp Weld, a military installation situated just on the southern perimeter of the settlement, a place of flat roofs and adobe walls that baked in the early autumn sun. The procession did not enter the city unnoticed. As the wagons rolled past the outlying shacks and businesses, the citizens of Denver stopped their work to stare. These were the faces of the enemy. These were the men who, in the minds of the white settlers, were responsible for the terror of the summer, for the high prices of flour, and for the sleepless nights spent guarding the trenches. The reaction from the street was visceral. Men spat into the dirt as the wagons passed. Women pulled their children back behind the folds of their skirts, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Low murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd, creating a gauntlet of hostility that the chiefs had to endure with stoic silence. They sat upright, wrapped in their blankets, their faces impassive, though they were acutely aware that they were entering the stronghold of a people who wanted them dead. Major Wynkoop rode at the head of the column, his posture rigid. He knew the precarious nature of this meeting. He had brought these men here under a flag of truce, promising them a chance to speak with the Great Father's representative, Governor Evans. But Wynkoop also knew the mood in Denver. He had seen the way the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, now encamped and eager for blood, looked at any native. He understood that by bringing Black Kettle into the city, he was walking a razor's edge between diplomacy and treason in the eyes of the hardliners. The air was thick with the dust kicked up by the horses and the tension that seemed to radiate from the brick walls of the town itself. The wagons pulled into the parade ground of Camp Weld. The dust settled on the uniforms of the soldiers who stood guard, their rifles held at the ready. The chiefs dismounted, their moccasins touching the hard-packed earth of the military post. They were ushered not into a grand hall, but into a low-ceilinged room used for officers' business. The furniture was utilitarian, rough-hewn tables and wooden chairs that scraped loudly against the floorboards. The room smelled of stale tobacco smoke, damp wool, and the dry, alkaline dust that permeated everything in the territory. Inside the room waited the architects of the territory's policy. Governor John Evans sat at the head of the table. He looked tired, his eyes darting and nervous. He was a man caught in a trap of his own making. He had spent months convincing Washington that a massive Indian war was underway to secure funding and troops. He had authorized the raising of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. Now, faced with chiefs suing for peace, he realized that accepting their surrender would undermine his entire political narrative. If there was peace, there was no need for the regiment. If there was no need for the regiment, the expense was unjustified, and his credibility would shatter. Next to Evans sat Colonel John Chivington. The contrast between the two men was stark. While Evans was wiry and anxious, Chivington was a monolith. He was a man of immense physical bulk, his uniform straining across his chest and shoulders. He sat with a brooding intensity, his thick neck settling into his collar. He did not speak initially. He simply watched the chiefs with a cold, predatory gaze. His hands, large and heavy, rested on the table like mallets. Also present were other officials, including Simeon Whiteley, the Indian agent, and scribes ready to record the words that would determine the fate of thousands. The chiefs took their seats. Black Kettle was the central figure for the Cheyenne. He was a man of middle age, his face lined by the sun and the stress of leadership. He wore a medal on his chest, a silver peace medal given to him by previous commissioners, a symbol of his commitment to friendship with the white government. White Antelope, older and frailer, sat with a quiet dignity, believing that the paper treaties he had signed in years past still held power. They had come to talk of peace, to offer the return of captives, and to secure a place where their women and children could sleep without fear of the soldiers. The interpreter, John Smith, took his position. The dialogue began, halting and difficult, bridging two languages that had no common root. Governor Evans opened the proceedings not with a welcome, but with an interrogation. He demanded to know why the chiefs had not come sooner. He referenced the circular he had issued in June, the one telling friendly Indians to report to the forts. He asked why they had ignored it. Black Kettle answered, his voice steady, explained through Smith that they had not seen the paper. They lived on the Buffalo Range, far from the post offices and settlements. When they finally heard of the order from the half-breeds and traders, they had come as quickly as they could to Fort Lyon to show they were not hostile. Evans leaned forward, his tone aggressive. He was looking for a confession. He asked who had been killing the settlers. He asked who had stolen the livestock. He was trying to pin the blame for the summer's raids specifically on the men in the room to justify the military buildup. Black Kettle and the others admitted that there were young men in their camps who had gone out against their orders, driven by anger and hunger. But they asserted that the chiefs had done everything in their power to stop them. They explained that the dog soldiers and other warrior societies often acted independently, and that the chiefs could not control every individual across the vast plains. The governor was unsatisfied. He pressed them on specific incidents. He brought up the Hungate family, asking point blank if the Cheyenne were responsible. The room went silent as the question was translated. The chiefs denied it. They spoke of the Arapaho or the Kiowa or the Comanche, trying to deflect the blame from their own bands, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate need to separate their peaceful families from the acts of the war parties. Evans twisted their words, looking for contradictions. He told them that because they had been at war with the United States, he could not simply sign a new treaty. He claimed that the power to make peace now rested with the soldiers, not with him. This was a crucial deflection. Evans was washing his hands of the diplomatic solution, passing the responsibility to the military arm, represented by the silent giant sitting next to him. The conversation ground on for hours. The air in the room grew heavy and hot. Flies buzzed against the glass of the windows. The chiefs offered to join the soldiers to fight against the Kiowa and Comanche, the tribes south of the Arkansas who were still raiding. They offered to serve as scouts. They offered anything that would prove their loyalty. Evans dismissed these offers. He told them that the Great Father in Washington was angry, that the soldiers were coming to punish the hostiles, and that it was too late to talk of alliances. He was speaking to them as a man who had already signed their death warrants, but could not admit it to their faces. Major Wynkoop watched the exchange with growing dread. He had brought these men here believing that Evans would welcome the chance to end the hostilities without further bloodshed. Instead, he saw the governor maneuvering to ensure the war continued. Wynkoop tried to interject to vouch for the sincerity of Black Kettle, but he was outranked and outmaneuvered in the political arena of the conference room. He saw the confusion in the eyes of the chiefs as the interpreter struggled to convey the legalistic and evasive answers of the governor. Finally, Colonel Chivington spoke. His voice was a deep rumble that commanded immediate attention. He did not engage in the circular arguments of the governor. He cut to the bone. He stood up, his height dwarfing the others in the room. He looked at the chiefs and delivered a statement that was both an ultimatum and a trap. He said that his rule of fighting white men or Indians was to fight them until they laid down their arms and submitted to military authority. He told them that they were near to the soldiers at Fort Lyon. He said they could go there, and if they were willing to submit to the major in command, they might find safety. The phrasing was deliberate. Chivington did not promise a treaty. He did not promise protection. He promised only that they could submit to military authority. To the chiefs filtering these words through the interpreter and their own cultural understanding, this sounded like an agreement. They heard that if they went to Fort Lyon and camped there, they would be under the care of the army. They believed that submitting to military authority meant checking in, turning over some weapons, and living peacefully near the fort, just as they had done in winters past. They did not understand that to Chivington, submission meant unconditional surrender as prisoners of war, liable to be killed or imprisoned at the whim of the victor. The meeting concluded in a haze of ambiguity. The chiefs felt a sense of relief. They believed they had looked the white leaders in the eye and secured a path to survival. They had returned the white captives they had brought with them, a gesture they thought proved their good faith. They shook hands with Evans and Chivington. The physical contact between the hand of Black Kettle and the hand of Chivington was a moment of profound deception. The colonel's grip was firm, conveying a soldier's assurance, but his mind was already calculating the logistics of the campaign he intended to launch against these very men. Evans told them again as they prepared to leave that they must keep their young men from the warpath. He warned them that the soldiers were many and their patience was gone. The chiefs nodded, agreeing to everything. White Antelope, his old face weary, believed he had saved the women and children from the coming snow and the soldiers' rifles. He adjusted his blanket, the piece metal clinking softly against the beads on his chest. As the chiefs walked out of the room and back into the harsh sunlight of the parade ground, the disconnect was absolute. The military and political leadership of Colorado had just told the natives that the civil government could do nothing for them and that they were now subjects of the military. The natives believed they had just negotiated a peace treaty that allowed them to winter at Fort Lyon. This gap in understanding was not accidental. It was cultivated by Evans and Chivington to keep their options open. They watched the wagons load up again. The return journey through the streets of Denver was different for the chiefs now. They felt they carried good news. They did not look at the hateful faces of the crowd with the same trepidation. They were thinking of the long ride back to the Smoky Hill River, of gathering their scattered bands, and of the move to the safety of the Arkansas River. They were thinking of the buffalo meat they needed to dry for the winter and the new lodge poles they needed to cut. They were unaware that the man they had just shaken hands with, Colonel Chivington, was already planning to recall the 3rd Colorado Cavalry from their scattered outposts and concentrate them for a strike. Back inside the office at Camp Weld, the atmosphere shifted the moment the door closed behind the delegation. Evans and Chivington conferred. Evans was still agitated. He worried that Washington would see this meeting as a peace settlement and cancel the authorization for the regiment. He needed to be sure that the War Department understood that the war was still active. He sat down to draft telegrams that would downplay the peaceful intent of the chiefs and emphasize the continued danger. He framed the meeting not as a peace council, but as a demand for surrender that had not yet been met. Chivington was more direct. He had seen the enemy. He knew where they were going. They were voluntarily concentrating themselves at Fort Lyon. This made his job infinitely easier. He would not have to chase them across the thousands of square miles of the high plains. He could wait until they were settled, until they were lulled into a sense of security, and then he could strike them all in one place. The meeting had served as a reconnaissance mission for him. He had measured Black Kettle and found him trusting. He had measured Wynkoop and found him soft. He knew he would have to replace Wynkoop at Fort Lyon with a harder man, someone who understood the necessity of the coming action before he could launch his attack. The sun began to dip below the mountains to the west, casting long shadows across Camp Weld. The dust motes in the council room settled on the empty chairs. The smell of the tobacco lingered. The decision had been made in the silence of what was not said. There would be no peace. The paper that Evans had refused to sign was the death warrant. The handshake was the seal. The tragedy was now a matter of logistics and timing. For the soldiers of the 3rd Regiment waiting in their camps, the news of the meeting would filter down as rumors. They would hear that the Indians had come to town and talked big. They would hear that the governor had told them off. The anger in the ranks would not dissipate, it would simmer. They had not joined up to watch chiefs ride in wagons, they had joined up to fight. The fact that the chiefs were allowed to leave the city alive was seen by many in the ranks as a sign of weakness, a mistake that they would have to correct later with their carbines. As night fell on September 28th, the wagons carrying the chiefs were miles away, moving slowly south under the vast canopy of stars. Black Kettle likely looked up at the sky, feeling the cool air of autumn, and thought that he had navigated the storm. He did not know that the storm was not behind him, but gathering strength in the very office he had just vacated. The mechanism of the massacre was now fully engaged. The wheels were turning, greased by the ambiguity of the conference and the ambition of the men who held the power. The peace camp at Sand Creek was now an inevitability, not as a sanctuary but as a target. The date was set in the flow of events, and the dawn that would turn the camp into a killing field was now only 2 months away. The deception at Camp Weld was total. It was a diplomatic maneuver designed to strip the tribes of their defenses while preserving the legal fiction of a just war for the white authorities. It relied on the language barrier, on the cultural differences regarding the concept of land and ownership, and on the desperate hope of the starving tribes. It was a betrayal committed with fountain pens and silence before it was ever committed with howitzers and sabers. The ink on the governor's notes was dry, and the path to the massacre was paved. November 2nd, 1864. The wind sweeping across the parade ground of Fort Lyon carried the bite of the coming winter, rattling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods along the Arkansas River. Inside the commander's office, the atmosphere was more frigid than the air outside. Major Edward Wynkoop, the man who had escorted the chiefs to Denver and staked his reputation on the peace process, held a piece of paper that effectively ended his tenure. The orders had come down from General Samuel Curtis, the department commander. Curtis was a man who viewed negotiation as weakness. His directive was blunt. He wanted no peace until the Indians had suffered more. He condemned Wynkoop's initiative in taking the chiefs to Camp Weld as an unauthorized indulgence. Wynkoop was relieved of his command. His replacement stood in the room with him. Major Scott Anthony of the 1st Colorado Cavalry was a man of a different cut. He had arrived with clear instructions to tighten the noose. Anthony was ambitious, politically savvy, and aligned with the hardline stance of Chivington and Evans. He viewed the natives not as human beings with legitimate grievances, but as a nuisance to be managed and eventually removed. The transfer of power was more than a bureaucratic formality. It was the closing of the only door that remained open for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Wynkoop argued his case one last time, pointing out that the tribes had shown good faith, that they had returned captives, and that they were starving. Anthony listened with a polite, detached expression. He assured Wynkoop that he would continue the policy of holding the natives as prisoners of war for their own safety, but his eyes betrayed a different intent. The immediate problem facing Major Anthony was the presence of the Arapaho band led by Left Hand. They were already camped near the fort, living in a squalor that defied description. They had come in seeking the protection promised by the governor's proclamation. They were hungry. Their ponies were rib-thin, grazing on the sparse, dead grass around the post. Their lodges were tattered, the buffalo hides worn thin by years of constant movement and insufficient hunting. Anthony decided to assert his authority immediately. He ordered that the Arapaho surrender their weapons. The surrender was a chaotic, humiliating spectacle. The warriors walked forward and placed their arms on the ground. The pile that accumulated was a testament to their desperation, not their military might. There were a few trade muskets rusted and held together with rawhide. There were bows made of ash with quivers of arrows that were bent and scarce. There were knives worn down to slivers of steel. It was not an arsenal. It was a junk pile. Anthony looked at the weapons with disdain. He realized that by disarming them completely, he became responsible for feeding them. If they could not hunt, they would rely entirely on the army rations, and the fort's stores were already low. In a twist of logic that confused the Arapaho, Anthony returned the bows and the less effective firearms. He told them to keep them so they could hunt small game to supplement their rations. He kept the few serviceable rifles. To Left Hand and his people, this act was interpreted as a sign of trust. They believed the new soldier chief was fair. They did not understand that Anthony was merely managing his logistics. He did not want them to starve on his doorstep because it would be a nuisance, not because he cared for their lives. In the middle of November, the main body of the Cheyenne arrived. Black Kettle brought his people in from the Smoky Hill country, believing that the handshake in Denver guaranteed their safety. He rode into Fort Lyon with a sense of relief. He had convinced the younger men, the ones who wanted to fight, that the white men would honor their word. He brought with him hundreds of people, families, old men, and children. They set up their lodges alongside the Arapaho, creating a large, sprawling village of refugees in the shadow of the military post. Black Kettle requested a council with Major Anthony. The meeting took place in the same office where Wynkoop had been relieved. Black Kettle spoke of the Peace Council. He said his people were ready to do whatever the soldier chief asked. He repeated his desire to live under the flag of the United States. Anthony played a duplicitous game. To Black Kettle's face, he was agreeable. He nodded and spoke of peace. He told the chief that he was waiting for further instructions from General Curtis, but until then the Cheyenne were under the protection of the fort. However, the presence of so many natives was straining the fort's resources. The livestock of the tribes was eating the grass that the cavalry horses needed. The sanitation around the post was deteriorating. Anthony wanted them gone, but he wanted them where he could find them. He proposed a solution that would seal their fate. He told Black Kettle and Left Hand that they could not stay at the fort. The grazing was too poor and the soldiers did not like them so close. He ordered them to move their camp to Sand Creek, a tributary of the Arkansas River located about 40 miles to the northeast. Anthony sold this location as a sanctuary. He told them the buffalo were plentiful there. He said the grass was good for their ponies. Most importantly, he gave them his word as an officer that if they went to Sand Creek and stayed there, they would be considered friendly and safe from attack. He promised that once he received the final peace papers from the East, he would come out to the camp himself to finalize the treaty. It was a lie constructed with professional precision. Anthony had no intention of making a treaty. He was simply moving the target to a kill box where the mess would be far away from the fort's daily operations. The Cheyenne and Arapaho accepted the order. They had no choice. They were starving, and the promise of a hunting ground was irresistible. They began to strike their lodges. The women dismantled the teepees, rolling the heavy hides and lashing the poles to the horses. The camp dogs barked and snapped as the travois were loaded with the meager possessions of the families. Iron cooking pots, sleeping robes, and the few sacks of flour they had received from the commissary. The ration distribution before they left was an exercise in cruelty. The army issued them prisoner rations, which were significantly less than what a soldier received. The flour was often weevil-ridden, the hardtack moldy, and the beef tough and stringy. But to people who had been eating boiled roots and moccasin leather, it was a feast. They took the food with gratitude, reinforcing their belief that the soldiers were their benefactors. Anthony watched the distribution from the porch of the commissary, his arms crossed, calculating how long the supplies would last. The departure from Fort Lyon was a slow, mournful procession. The horses were too weak to trot. The column moved at a walk, dragging deep furrows in the sandy soil. The wind blew dust into the faces of the children who peered out from the bundles on the travois. Black Kettle rode at the front, his chest swelling with a mix of anxiety and hope. He was following orders. He was doing exactly what the white men had told him to do. He believed that obedience was the shield that would protect his people. As the tribes moved northeast away from the Arkansas River, the landscape became more desolate. The plains here were rolling and vast, covered in short buffalo grass that had turned brown with the frost. There were no trees, only the endless horizon. The wind gathered speed across the open ground, cutting through the thin blankets of the travelers. They walked for 2 days, covering the 40 miles with the endurance born of necessity. When they arrived at Sand Creek, they found the location Anthony had described. The creek itself was largely dry, a bed of sand with pockets of water pooling in the deeper depressions. However, along the banks there were stands of cottonwood trees, their gray branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. The trees offered fuel for fires and a break from the wind. The bluffs on either side of the creek rose up to provide a natural wall against the elements. It was a good place for a winter camp. The families began to set up their new home. The lodges were erected in the bend of the creek, utilizing the high banks for shelter. The Cheyenne camped on the western side of the village, while the Arapaho under Left Hand set up on the eastern side. In total, there were over 100 lodges housing perhaps 600 to 700 people. The vast majority were women, children, and old men. Most of the young warriors, the dog soldiers, had refused to come in, staying out on the Smoky Hill River to hunt and prepare for war. This left the Sand Creek camp with a demographic that was almost entirely non-combatant. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm of waiting. The men used the returned weapons to hunt for antelope and jackrabbits in the surrounding hills. The women gathered wood and scraped hides. Smoke rose from the smoke holes of the teepees, curling into the gray sky. At night, the temperature dropped well below freezing. The families huddled together under their buffalo robes, the firelight flickering on the lodge poles. They told stories and speculated about when Major Anthony would come with the peace papers. They felt secure. They were 40 miles from the soldiers in the place they were ordered to be. Back at Fort Lyon, Major Anthony was writing letters. He wrote to General Curtis and other commanders stating that he had the Indians where he could lay his hands on them. He requested reinforcements, stating that the garrison at Fort Lyon was too small to effectively punish the tribes. He made no mention of the peace promises or the safe conduct he had guaranteed. In his correspondence, the people at Sand Creek were not protected refugees. They were a concentration of hostiles waiting to be struck. Captain Silas Soule, a company commander under Anthony and a friend of Wincoop, watched these developments with a growing sickness in his gut. Soule was a jayhawker from Kansas, an abolitionist who had fought for the freedom of slaves. He had a rigid moral code that did not bend for convenience. He saw what Anthony was doing. He heard the doublespeak. He walked the perimeter of the fort, talking to his men, trying to gauge their mood. He found that many of the soldiers at Fort Lyon who had known these natives for months did not share the bloodlust of the new arrivals or the politicians. They had traded with these people. They knew them by name. The idea of attacking the camp at Sand Creek seemed dishonorable to them. But Soule was a captain. He had to obey orders until those orders became criminal. In late November, the isolation of the Sand Creek camp was absolute. No traders came out to them. No news arrived from the outside world. They were an island in the sea of grass. Black Kettle, ever the diplomat, kept a large American flag that had been given to him years before. He kept it folded in his lodge, ready to hoist it on a long pole should any soldiers appear to show his allegiance. He also had a white flag, a symbol of truce that was universally understood, or so he thought. The camp was not fortified. There were no sentries posted on the distant ridges because they did not believe they were at war. The horses were turned loose to graze on the bluffs during the day and herded closer to the lodges at night, not to prevent theft by soldiers, but to protect them from wolves or rival tribes. The mindset was one of peace. The warrior societies that usually guarded the perimeter were absent. The defense of the camp rested on the word of a major who was currently 40 miles away, plotting their destruction. One incident in late November solidified the camp's false sense of security. A few men from the camp rode back to Fort Lyon to check on the status of the promises. They were met by Anthony, who again reassured them. He gave them a few sacks of sugar and coffee, luxuries that were highly prized. He sent them back with a smile, telling them to stay put and that everything was proceeding as planned. The men rode back to Sand Creek with the sweet taste of sugar on their tongues. Telling the others that the soldier chief was a friend, this final act of deception ensured that no one would move, no one would run, and no one would be awake when the hammer fell. The physical condition of the people at Sand Creek continued to deteriorate despite the hunting. The winter was setting in hard. The game was scarce near the creek. The children were thin, their ribs showing through their skin. Coughing sickness spread through the lodges. The sanctuary was becoming a prison of cold and hunger. They waited for the supplies Anthony had promised. They waited for the blankets. They waited for the salvation of the treaty. They did not know that the only thing heading their way was the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. By November 26th, the camp was fully established. The paths between the lodges were packed down by hundreds of moccasined feet. The daily routine was fixed. The sun rose, the women worked, the men hunted or smoked, and the sun set. The monotony was a comfort. It meant there was no fighting. It meant the war was something happening far away, to other people. Major Wynkoop, now traveling east to answer for his conduct, sat in a wagon bouncing across the plains miles away from the tragedy unfolding. He likely looked back toward the west, hoping that his successor would honor the moral obligation he had established. He did not know that his departure had removed the final barrier. The checks and balances of conscience had been stripped away from the command at Fort Lyon. The machinery of the military was now operating without the governor of humanity. At Sand Creek, the nights were long and silent. The wind howled through the ravines, sounding like distant voices. The coyotes yipped in the darkness. Inside the lodge of Black Kettle, the chief slept fitfully. He carried the burden of his people's survival. He had led them away from the war, away from the anger of the young men, and into the care of the government. He trusted that he had made the right choice. He trusted the flag he kept ready. He trusted Major Anthony. The stage was now perfectly set. The victims were clustered in a depression in the earth, hidden from view until one was right on top of them. They were disarmed of their best weapons. They were weakened by hunger. They were politically isolated, and most fatally, they were psychologically disarmed by the lie of protection. They were not a war camp. They were a sitting duck, tethered to the ground by their own obedience. The sun went down on the evening of the 27th, and the people of the village went to sleep unaware that the timeline of their existence had been reduced 2 hours. The promise of supplies had been the bait, and the dawn was bringing the hunter. November 28, 1864. The landscape of the southeastern Colorado Territory was a study in desolation, buried under a foot of hard-packed snow that had fallen days prior. The temperature hovered near zero, a biting cold that turned breath into ice crystals instantly upon exhalation. Moving through this frozen white expanse was a column of men and horses that stretched for nearly a mile. This was the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, finally in motion for the kill. They were reinforced by elements of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, bringing the total force to nearly 700 men. The horses, their coats shaggy and matted with ice, labored through the drifts. Their breath plumed in the gray light, and their hooves broke through the crust of the snow with a rhythmic crunching sound that was swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. Colonel John Chivington rode near the front. His massive frame was wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, his face obscured by a scarf to protect against the frostbite that threatened every exposed inch of skin. He was a man possessed by a singular urgency. The enlistments of the 100 Dazers were expiring rapidly. Some men had already served their time but were kept in the ranks by the promise of immediate action. If he did not strike now, his army would dissolve into a collection of civilians walking home, and his political career would evaporate with them. The march was a race against the calendar as much as it was a military maneuver. The condition of the volunteers was wretched. They had been in the field for weeks, enduring the transition from autumn to deep winter without adequate supplies. Their uniforms were stained with grease and dirt. Their boots were worn thin, leading many to wrap their feet in burlap or raw hide to keep the toes from freezing black. The grumbling in the ranks had ceased, replaced by a grim determination. The misery of the march fueled their anger. They blamed the natives for this frozen hell. Every shiver, every pang of hunger, and every frozen finger was another debt to be collected in blood. The bloodless 3rd was freezing, and they wanted heat, the heat of battle and the heat of burning lodges. As the column approached the vicinity of Fort Lyon, Chivington issued strict orders for silence. The element of surprise was the only tactical advantage they needed, and it was absolute. He knew that the fort was currently commanded by Major Scott Anthony, his ally in policy, but he also knew that the fort contained officers and men who had served under Wynkoop. There were men there who believed in the peace process, men who might send a runner to warn Black Kettle if they saw the size of the force approaching. Chivington intended to secure the fort before anyone could strike a match or saddle a horse. The sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The walls of Fort Lyon appeared in the distance, a collection of low stone and adobe, buildings sitting on the north bank of the Arkansas River. Smoke rose lazily from the chimneys, indicating warmth and food. The sight of the fort spurred the column forward. The horses smelled the hay and the water, picking up their pace despite their exhaustion. The arrival of the regiment at the fort was sudden and overwhelming. Chivington did not ride up to the gate and ask for permission to enter. He swarmed the installation. He ordered his men to surround the post immediately. A cordon of pickets was established in a tight circle around the perimeter. The order given to these guards was explicit and lethal. No one was to leave the fort under any circumstances. If any man, soldier, or civilian attempted to cross the line, he was to be shot on sight. This was effectively a military coup of the outpost. The fort was not being reinforced. It was being captured by its own side to ensure silence. Inside the fort, the garrison was taken completely off guard. Soldiers looked out of the barracks windows to see hundreds of armed men encircling them. The courtyard filled with the horses of the 3rd. Major Anthony came out to meet Chivington. The two men conferred quickly. Anthony was expecting them, but perhaps not the sheer scale of the force or the ferocity of Chivington's demeanor. Chivington made it clear that he was taking command of the entire district. He asked Anthony for the exact location of the Indian camp. Anthony confirmed they were at Sand Creek, roughly 40 miles to the north, just as he had ordered them. He told Chivington the village was large, containing the bands of Black Kettle and Left Hand, along with 8 or 10 other chiefs. The logistics of the lockdown were brutal. Chivington ordered that even the mail carriers were to be detained. No letters were to go out. The stagecoaches were stopped. The telegraph key was silenced. He created a black hole of information. For the next 24 hours, Fort Lyon ceased to exist as far as the outside world was concerned. This total embargo ensured that no sympathetic trader or conflicted officer could slip away into the night to ride the 40 miles and alert the sleeping camp. The friction between the regulars of the 1st Regiment stationed at the fort and the volunteers of the 3rd flared immediately. The regulars, who had been patrolling the plains for years, looked at the ragtag appearance of the volunteers with professional disdain. But more importantly, many of the officers at Fort Lyon were appalled by Chivington's stated intent. Captain Silas Soule, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, and Lieutenant James Connor were summoned to a meeting with Chivington. These men had been part of the peace negotiations. They had shaken hands with the chiefs. They knew that the people at Sand Creek were there under the specific protection of the flag and the promise of the army. The confrontation that followed in the officers' quarters was heated. Soule argued directly with Chivington. He stated that attacking a peaceful camp that was under the protection of the fort was murder, not war. He pointed out that these natives had surrendered their prisoners and had complied with every order given to them. He called the operation a violation of the soldiers' honor. Chivington's reaction was explosive. He paced the room, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards. He shook his fist in Soule's face. He shouted that he believed it to be right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. He declared that he would damn any man who sympathized with Indians. He threatened to court-martial Soule and the others. He threatened to have them shot if they refused to march. The power dynamic was entirely on Chivington's side. He had the rank, he had the numbers, and he had the political backing. Soule and the other dissenters were backed into a corner. They could refuse and face a firing squad or imprisonment, in which case the massacre would happen anyway, or they could march with the column and see if they could mitigate the horror or at least witness it for the record. They chose to march. But the division in the force was palpable. The fort was split between those who were eager for the slaughter and those who were sickened by the prospect. Outside in the cold, the enlisted men of the 3rd were mingling with the garrison. They were refueling. The fort's stores were opened. Sacks of corn were broken open for the starving horses. The men raided the commissary for coffee and bacon. They warmed themselves by the fires, thawing their frozen limbs. The talk was all about the target. The volunteers learned that the camp was not a war party stronghold, but a village of families. This information did not dampen their enthusiasm. For many, it increased it. A village meant plunder. It meant buffalo robes, ponies, and trophies. The dehumanization that had begun in Denver was now complete. The target was not an enemy force. It was a resource to be harvested. The night of the 27th was sleepless for many. Chivington spent the hours organizing the combined force. He took the best horses from the fort stables to replace the broken-down nags of the volunteers. He ordered the howitzers, 12-pound mountain guns, to be prepared for travel. These cannons were small, mobile, and devastating against soft targets like skin lodges. The artillery crews checked the caissons, ensuring they had canister shot and spherical case shells. The inclusion of artillery signaled that this was not a skirmish. It was a bombardment. Major Anthony, eager to prove his loyalty to the hardline faction, offered to join the expedition with 125 men from the Fort Lyon garrison. He told Chivington he would lead them himself. This addition swelled the ranks further. It also implicated the regular army directly in the operation. It was no longer just a volunteer militia action. It was a unified strike by the United States military apparatus. The atmosphere inside the fort walls was claustrophobic. The air smelled of wood smoke, manure, and tension. The sentries walked the walls, looking inward as much as outward. No one was trusted. A trader named John Smith, who was visiting the fort, was also detained. He had a son in the Cheyenne camp. Chivington knew that a man like Smith would ride until his horse died to save his family. Smith was kept under guard, unable to send a signal. The net was tight. As the hours ticked by, the weather held its grip. The sky remained overcast, blocking out the moon. This darkness was an asset. The plan was to move out the following night, covering the 40 miles in a single march to arrive at dawn. The 27th was the day of staging, the day the trap snapped shut on the fort so it could be opened on the village. The men of the 3rd checked their weapons by the light of the lanterns. They loaded the paper cartridges into their carbines. They sharpened their knives. On whetstones, the rasping sound joining the low murmur of voices. They were writing no letters home because of the lockdown. They were trapped in the immediate reality of the mission. The deadline of their enlistment was a drumbeat in their heads. They had to kill now, or they would go home as the bloodless 3rd, the laughingstock of the territory. The pressure to commit violence was internal and external. Chivington moved among the companies, his presence reinforcing the mandate. He did not speak of tactics or flanking maneuvers. He spoke of nits make lice, a phrase attributed to him that justified the killing of children. The logic was that small Indians grew into big Indians, so the solution was total eradication. This philosophy was filtered down to the rank and file, removing any hesitation a man might have about shooting a toddler. It was pest control logic applied to human beings. The horses in the corral huddled together for warmth. The steam from their bodies created a low, thick fog in the enclosure. They were being fed extra grain, fueling them for the hard ride ahead. The animals were the engine of the massacre, and their condition was critical. The farriers worked through the night, hammering iron shoes onto hooves, the ringing of the hammers echoing off the adobe walls. By the time the sun set on the 27th, Fort Lyon was a loaded weapon. The peaceful outpost, which had been a place of negotiation just weeks earlier, had been transformed into a launch pad for annihilation. The peace flag that flew over the parade ground was a mockery. The officers who had honored it were silenced. The men who intended to violate it were in command. The isolation of the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek was now physically enforced by the ring of sentries around Fort Lyon. There was no possibility of a warning. The 40 miles of prairie between the fort and the camp were empty and silent. The wind blew across the snow, carrying no sound of the gathering storm. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just a betrayal of a treaty, it was a betrayal of the fundamental trust that allowed communication between peoples. Chivington had weaponized the peace process, using the concentration of the tribes and the silence of the fort to ensure a slaughter. The friction between the two units, the 100 Dazers and the veterans of the 1st, manifested in small, gritty details throughout the evening. In the mess hall, lines were drawn. The veterans of the 1st, their uniforms faded by sun and repaired with whatever thread was at hand, ate their rations with a practiced efficiency. They watched the volunteers of the 3rd, who were loud, boisterous, and clumsy with their gear. The volunteers, defensive and aggressive, interpreted every glance from a regular as an insult. Arguments broke out over space at the stoves. A volunteer would shove a veteran to get closer to the heat, sparking a scuffle that had to be broken up by sergeants barking orders. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale grease, and unwashed bodies. The equipment check revealed the stark differences in the two forces. The regulars carried Sharps carbines, breech-loading weapons that were reliable and accurate. They had well-maintained saddles and kit. The volunteers were a motley collection. Some carried the heavy Austrian muskets that were more club than rifle. Others had old squirrel guns or double-barreled shotguns brought from home. Their saddles were often civilian models, ill-fitted for military campaigning, causing sores on the horses' backs. This disparity was a point of contention. The volunteers felt the government had slighted them, giving the real soldiers the best gear while sending them out to freeze with junk. Chivington used this resentment. He told them the equipment didn't make the soldier, the fight did. He turned their envy into a desire to prove that they could kill just as well with a musket as a regular could with a carbine. Outside, the cold was a physical weight. The temperature dropped steadily as the night deepened. The snow on the ground was not the soft, fluffy variety. It was hard, wind-scoured ice that cut like glass. The sentries posted on the perimeter had to be rotated every hour to prevent frostbite. Their mustaches coated with ice, their hands wrapped in mittens grew numb around the stocks of their rifles. The landscape around the fort was flat and featureless, a sea of white that reflected the gray starlight. There was no cover for miles. Any attempt to escape the fort would have been visible as a dark speck on a white sheet. The isolation was total. Chivington's decision to seize the mail was not just a precaution. It was a strategic severing of the timeline. By stopping the mail, he ensured that no official protest could be lodged in time to stop him. He knew that if General Curtis or the authorities in Washington knew he was attacking a camp that had surrendered, they might issue a countermand. By the time the mail started moving again, the deed would be done, the camp destroyed and the victory reported. He was creating a fait accompli. He physically confiscated the mail bags that were ready to go out, locking them in a secure room. The drivers were ordered to stay in their quarters. The disruption to the communication network was absolute. The medical preparations were grim. The surgeons of the 3rd, men who were often as raw as the recruits, began to prepare their kits. They checked their saws and their supplies of chloroform and morphine. They were not preparing for a battle with a heavily armed enemy. They were preparing for the accidents of a chaotic slaughter. Accidental discharges, friendly fire, and the few injuries that might come from a desperate defense. They rolled bandages and packed lint. The smell of the medical alcohol mixed with the other odors of the fort, a sharp, sterile scent that signaled the anticipation of torn flesh. Horses remained the primary concern. The forage at the fort was rapidly depleted by the influx of 700 animals. The quartermasters shouted and argued as they distributed the last of the hay. The horses chewed the wood of the corral fences in their hunger. The sound of hundreds of animals grinding their teeth and stomping their hooves created a low, constant rumble that underpinned the human activity. These animals had to carry heavy men and heavy gear 40 miles through deep snow at a combat pace. The success of the mission rested on their failing legs. Chivington's meeting with the officers of the 1st extended into a psychological browbeating. He did not just threaten them. He questioned their manhood. He asked if they were afraid to fight. He called them Indian lovers, a term that carried the weight of treason in that time and place. He dismantled their moral objections by framing them as cowardice. For a young lieutenant like Kramer standing before a man of Chivington's size and rank, the pressure was crushing. To refuse was to be branded a coward and a traitor. To agree was to become a murderer. The moral injury began in that room, long before the first shot was fired. They walked out of the meeting pale and shaken, their orders in hand, their honor compromised. The enlisted men of the 3rd, meanwhile, were engaging in their own form of psychological preparation. They checked their trophies, the scalps some claimed to have taken in minor skirmishes or the ones they had bought. They sharpened their knives with a ritualistic intensity. The concept of scalping had been appropriated by the white volunteers. They spoke of it openly. They intended to take hair. It was a reversal of the savage trope. They would out-savage the savage. The campfire talk was filled with boasts of how many they would kill. They did not speak of capturing prisoners. The orders were, "Take no prisoners," and that suited the mood of the mob perfectly as midnight approached. The activity in the fort did not cease. The blacksmiths were still working. The cooks were baking hardtack for the march. The officers were studying the terrain maps, marking the dry creek bed of the Big Sandy. They planned the approach to utilize the high banks to hide their movement until the last possible second. They discussed the wind direction, hoping it would blow from the north to carry the sound of their approach away from the camp. The silence of the telegraph key was perhaps the most ominous sound of all. Usually the clatter of the key was the heartbeat of the fort, connecting it to the east. Now the wire was dead. The operator sat idle, under orders to touch nothing. The fort was cut off from civilization, operating under the rules of the Dark Ages. The law of the United States had been suspended within the walls of Fort Lyon, replaced by the will of one man. The moon remained hidden, but the snow provided a ghostly illumination. The sentries could see the breath of the horses in the corral. They could see the dark shapes of the howitzers, their barrels cold and black. The 12-pounders were the ultimate trump card. Against teepees made of buffalo hide, the spherical case shot. Hollow iron balls filled with musket balls and a bursting charge would be devastating. The shells were stacked in the caissons, rows of iron death waiting for the spark. By the early hours of the morning, the fort was a coil wound to its limit. The men were fed, the horses were shod, the dissenters were silenced, and the perimeter was secure. The plan was locked in. They would march the next day through the night to arrive at dawn. The 27th of November had served its purpose. It had concentrated the force and blinded the world. The transition from a military unit to a death squad was complete. The men who lay down to catch a few hours of sleep did so with their weapons within arm's reach. They dreamed of the kill. The long atmosphere of the impending violence hung over the fort like a shroud. The dawn of the 28th would bring the beginning of the march, the long, cold road that led directly to the sleeping families at Sand Creek. The lockdown held. The secret was safe. The massacre was guaranteed. The sun set over Fort Lyon, plunging the world into a darkness that felt less like the absence of light and more like the presence of a physical weight. The temperature, already well below freezing, began to plummet further as the cloud cover broke slightly, exposing the column to the vacuum of the night sky. Inside the fort, the order to mount up was given in low voices. There were no bugle calls. The silence was the primary weapon of the evening. 700 men swung into their saddles, the leather creaking in the cold air, the metal bits of the bridles jingling softly as the horses shook their heads. The steam from the animals and the men created a low, ground-hugging fog that swirled around the legs of the horses. Colonel Chivington rode at the head of the column. He looked like a bear in the saddle, his bulk wrapped in furs, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. Next to him rode the guide, a rancher named Jim Beckworth. Beckworth was an old mountain man, a legend in the territory who had lived with the Crows and knew the plains as well as anyone. He was there under hire, brought into service to lead the soldiers to the camp. He sat hunched against the wind, his face a map of weather-beaten skin, knowing exactly what waited at the end of the trail. The column moved out through the gates of the fort, leaving the safety of the walls behind. They did not take the main road. They struck out across the open prairie, heading north-northeast, aiming for the depression in the earth 40 miles away. The formation was loose, the snow was deep, crusted over with a layer of ice that broke under the weight of the horses. The sound was a constant rhythmic crunching, like the breaking of thousands of bones. The men rode with their collars turned up, their hats pulled low. They were already cold before they left the shadow of the fort. The wind came from the north, a direct headwind that drove the ice crystals into their faces. It found every gap in their clothing, stinging the skin and watering the eyes. The tears froze on their cheeks. The pace was punishing. Chivington set a trot whenever the ground allowed it. He was racing the sun. He needed to cover the 40 miles before the first light of dawn could betray their presence. The horses, many of them the same wretched animals that had marched from Denver, began to suffer immediately. They slipped on the ice, their iron shoes skating on the slick surface. When a horse went down, there was a muffled curse, the sound of a man scrambling out of the stirrups, and the struggle to get the animal back on its feet. If a horse could not rise, it was left. There was no time for mercy. The rider would double up with another man or walk until he could climb onto a caisson. The artillery battery was the anchor that slowed the march. The 12-pound mountain howitzers were mounted on carriages with small wheels that cut deep into the snow. The horses, pulling them, strained against the harnesses, their chests heaving, their nostrils flaring red in the darkness. The gun crews walked alongside the cannons, pushing on the wheels when they bogged down in the drifts. They cursed the guns, cursed the snow, and cursed the officers. The metal of the cannons was so cold that to touch it with a bare hand was to lose skin. The iron barrels absorbed the cold and radiated it back, black holes of freezing temperature dragging behind the column. As the hours wore on, the march became a hallucinatory experience for the men. The landscape was featureless. It was a white void in all directions. The only reference points were the back of the man in front and the stars overhead. The sensory deprivation caused the mind to wander. Men fell asleep in the saddle, waking up only when they nearly fell off or when their horse stumbled. The cold seeped into their boots, turning their toes into numb blocks of wood. They wiggled their fingers constantly inside, their mittens to keep the blood flowing. The pain of the cold was a dull, throbbing ache that settled in the marrow of the bones. There was no talking in the ranks. The order for silence was strictly enforced, but it was hardly necessary. The men were too miserable to speak. Their lips were chapped and frozen, their jaws clenched against the shivering. The only sounds were the wind, the crunch of the snow, and the labored breathing of the animals. It was a ghost army moving through a dead world. The isolation was profound. Each man was locked in his own personal struggle against the elements, united only by the direction of the march. Sometime around midnight, the column halted briefly. The men dismounted to check their cinches and to stomp their feet. The sound of 700 men stamping on the hard ground was like a low rumble of thunder. They checked their weapons. The cold could freeze the oil in the locks of the guns, rendering them useless. Men worked the actions of their carbines and revolvers, snapping them back and forth to ensure they were free. They blew warm breath into the mechanisms, a temporary fix that created more ice later. They gnawed on hardtack, the dry biscuits shattering in their mouths, trying to generate some internal heat. There were no fires. To light a match was a court-martial offense. Chivington moved up and down the line during the halt. He did not look tired. He looked energized by the ordeal. He hissed orders at the officers, telling them to keep the formation tight. He warned them that any man who fell behind would be left to freeze. He was driving them with the fear of the elements as much as military discipline. He checked on the howitzers. He patted the cold bronze of the barrels. These guns were his insurance. He knew that the Indians might fight from cover, from behind the banks of the creek. The cannons would dig them out. The march resumed. The terrain began to change slightly as they moved away from the river valley and onto the high tablelands. The wind grew stronger here, unimpeded by any bluffs. It howled across the snow, picking up the loose powder and creating ground blizzards that obscured the horses' knees. The guide, Beckworth, struggled to keep his bearings. The snow had altered the look of the land, burying the landmarks. He relied on the stars and an instinct honed by decades of survival. He rode with a grim fatalism. He knew the people in the camp. He had traded with them. He knew he was leading death to their door, but the pistol on Chivington's hip was a more immediate threat than his conscience. The psychological state of the men began to shift as the night deepened. The initial anger and bloodlust dulled into a singular desire for it to end. They just wanted to stop riding. They wanted to be off the horses. If that meant fighting, fine. If it meant killing, fine. They would do anything to get out of the saddle and near a fire. The violence became a means to an end, the end of the march. The destination was no longer a military objective, it was a release point. Among the officers of the 1st Regiment, the men like Captain Soule and Lieutenant Kramer rode in a knot of silence. They were trapped in the formation. Every mile they rode brought them closer to the violation of their honor. They watched the volunteers of the 3rd. They saw the lack of discipline even in the ride. The volunteers rode slouched, their weapons hanging loosely. Soule knew that once the shooting started, these men would be uncontrollable. He checked his own company, the men of the 1st who had served at the fort. He signaled them to stay close. He did not know what he would do when the order to fire was given. But he knew he wanted his men separate from the mob. The horses were failing. The weaker animals began to give out completely. They would simply stop, heads hanging, refusing to move. The riders would kick them, spur them, and whip them, but the animals were finished. The men would curse, grab their carbines and saddlebags, and start walking. The trail behind the column was littered with abandoned horses, dark shapes standing motionless in the snow, waiting to freeze to death. The wolves that trailed the column would feast before the sun was high. Around 3 in the morning, the column encountered a patch of deep sand disguised by the snow. The wheels of the howitzers sank to the axles. The forward momentum stopped. The men groaned. Officers shouted in hushed tones. They had to unhitch the horses and use ropes to drag the guns free. 50 men hauled on the line, slipping and cursing, their boots seeking traction on the ice. The physical exertion warmed them momentarily, but the sweat turned cold the instant they stopped. It was a brutal struggle against the physics of the plains. As they neared the 40-mile mark, the terrain began to dip. They were approaching the drainage of the Big Sandy. The air felt slightly different here, heavier, settling into the low ground. Beckworth signaled a halt. He rode back to Chivington. He whispered that they were close. He could smell the smoke of the campfires, a faint, acrid scent of burning buffalo chips and willow wood that hung in the valley. The camp was just over the next ridge. Chivington ordered the men to strip for action. This meant removing their heavy buffalo coats and tying them to the saddles. The men hesitated. To take off the coats was to invite the freezing wind against their uniform jackets. But they did it. They shivered violently as the cold hit them. They tightened their belts, they checked their cap pouches. They were transforming from travelers back into soldiers. The anticipation of the fight began to pump adrenaline through their veins, warming them from the inside. The plan was disseminated in whispers. They would split the force. One group would circle to the right, cutting off the horse herd. Another group would circle left. The main body with the artillery would charge directly down the center. The goal was containment. No one was to escape. Chivington wanted the village surrounded before the first shot. He wanted a killing bowl. The sky to the east began to lighten, a faint gray smudge against the black. The time was critical. They had to be in position before the sun broke the horizon. The column moved forward again, but slower now. The snow muffled their approach. They were predators creeping up on a sleeping prey. The silence was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, picking their feet up carefully. They reached the crest of the final ridge. Below them, in the gray light of pre-dawn, lay the camp. It was a sprawling collection of teepees, the white skins glowing faintly in the twilight. Smoke rose straight up from the smoke holes. It was peaceful. There were no sentries. The pony herd was grazing on the bluffs to the west, hundreds of animals scattered across the snow. The village was asleep. The people inside the lodges were warm, oblivious to the 700 men looking down on them. Chivington looked at the scene. He did not see families, he saw the enemy. He saw the validation of his regiment. He saw his political future. He turned to his officers. His face was set in a grimace of anticipation. He gave the signal to deploy. The column began to split, the wings moving out to encircle the sleeping camp. The movement was fluid, practiced. The men of the 3rd forgot the cold. They forgot their frozen feet. They gripped their weapons with a terrifying eagerness. The dogs in the camp began to bark, a few at first, then more. They sensed the intruders. But it was too late. The iron ring was already closing. The howitzers were being unlimbered on the ridge, the muzzles depressed to fire down into the lodges. The gunners rammed the charges home. The fuse was cut short for canister. On the ridge, the men paused for a split second, the precipice of violence. They could hear the first sounds of the camp, waking up, a cough, a child crying, the flap of a lodge door opening. These human sounds drifted up to them, intimate and vulnerable. But the men on the ridge had hardened their hearts. They remembered the Hungate bodies. They remembered the long march. They remembered the lies they had been told. They did not see people down there, they saw targets. Chivington raised his hand. The silence of the night, which had held for 12 agonizing hours, was about to be shattered. The march was over. The killing was about to begin. The frozen plains, indifferent to the suffering of the soldiers and the sleeping families alike, waited to receive the blood that would soon melt the snow. The dawn arrived not with the warmth of the sun, but with the cold flash of gunpowder. The night march had delivered its cargo of death to the doorstep of the peace camp, November 29th, 1864. The gray light of pre-dawn stretched across the eastern horizon, illuminating the frost that coated the buffalo grass on the ridges above Sand Creek. The temperature was still brutally low, freezing the breath of the 700 men and horses positioned on the high ground. Below them, the village of the Cheyenne and Arapaho lay in the quiet stillness of the early morning. Smoke curled lazily from the smoke holes of over 100 lodges, indicating that the women were beginning to stir, adding wood to the embers to chase away the night's chill. The camp was arranged in a horseshoe shape along the bend of the dry creek bed, sheltered by the high banks. To the west, the large pony herd, numbering nearly 500 animals, grazed on the sparse winter grass, their coats shaggy and dusted with snow. The silence of the valley was broken not by a bugle but by the thunder of hooves. Colonel Chivington initiated the attack with a tactical maneuver designed to strip the tribes of their mobility. He ordered a detachment of men to swing hard to the right, galloping across the frozen ground to cut between the village and the pony herd. The soldiers spurred their horses, the animals kicking up clods of ice and snow. They fired their revolvers into the air and screamed, driving the herd away from the lodges. The sound of the stampeding ponies, the shouts of the soldiers, and the crack of the pistol shots shattered the morning calm instantly. Inside the village, the noise woke the camp with a jolt of panic. Men grabbed their weapons, thinking a rival tribe was raiding their stock. Women clutched their children, eyes wide in the semi-darkness. Black Kettle, the peace chief who had staked his life and the lives of his people on the word of the white officers, crawled out of his lodge. He saw the line of blue-coated soldiers on the ridge. He saw the detachment cutting off the horses. His first reaction was not to fight, but to stop the fighting. He believed with a tragic certainty that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a signal. Black Kettle ran back into his lodge and retrieved the massive garrison flag that had been presented to him by Commissioner Greenwood years earlier. It was an American flag, its stripes broad and its stars bright, a symbol of protection and allegiance. He also grabbed a smaller white flag, the universal sign of truce. He hurried outside and tied the flags to a long lodge pole. He raised the pole high in the air, planting it firmly in the ground in front of his lodge. The flags caught the morning breeze, snapping audibly. The red, white, and blue stood out in stark contrast to the brown hides of the teepees and the white snow. Black Kettle shouted to his people. He told them not to be afraid. He told them the soldiers would not hurt them. He told them to stand by the flag. He was calling for order, trying to prevent the young men from firing back and provoking the troops. People flocked to him. Women carrying infants, old men wrapped in blankets, and children rubbing sleep from their eyes gathered around the lodge pole. They looked up at the flag and then up at the ridge, waiting for the soldiers to see it and stop. They believed in the sanctuary of the emblem. They stood in the open, clustered together, a dense target of humanity. On the ridge, the sight of the American flag did not halt the advance. It seemed to enrage the attackers. Chivington, watching the confusion in the camp, gave the order to open fire. The command rippled down the line. The soldiers of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, along with the detachments of the 1st, leveled their carbines and muskets. The distance was short, less than a few hundred yards. The volley that followed was deafening. Hundreds of weapons discharged simultaneously, creating a wall of smoke that instantly obscured the ridgeline. The impact on the crowd around the flag was catastrophic. The heavy caliber slugs from the Austrian muskets and the Sharps carbines tore through the mass of people. Women fell, clutching their chests. Children were thrown backward by the force of the strikes. The air filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. The belief in the flag evaporated in a mist of blood. The people realized in that split second that the flag offered no protection. It was merely a marker for the gunners. The artillery joined the slaughter. The 12-pound mountain howitzers positioned on the high ground to dominate the village roared to life. The gunners fired spherical case shot and canister. The canister rounds were essentially tin cans filled with iron balls that burst upon leaving the muzzle, turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. The iron balls swept through the thin skin of the lodges as if they were paper. They shredded the buffalo hides, smashed the lodge poles, and decimated the families hiding inside. The explosions threw dirt and snow into the air, mixing with the smoke to create a chaotic, blinding fog. White Antelope, the old chief who had sat in the council room in Denver and listened to Governor Evans, realized the depth of the betrayal. He was 75 years old. He saw his people falling around him. He saw the soldiers pouring down the slope, firing as they came. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. He stood in front of his lodge, arms folded across his chest, in the manner of a man accepting his fate. He began to sing his death song, a chant that rose above the crack of the rifles. "Nothing lives long," he sang, "except the earth and the mountains." He stood as a statue of dignity amidst the carnage until a bullet struck him, dropping him into the snow. He died where he fell, unarmed and unresisting. Left Hand, the Arapaho chief who had brought his people to Fort Lyon specifically to show his friendship, also refused to fight. He stood with his arms crossed, shouting at his warriors not to fire at the soldiers. He called out that the soldiers were their friends, that it was a mistake. He held this belief until a carbine round struck him down. The tragedy of the peace chiefs was absolute. They were killed by the very men they had trusted, using the very peace they had advocated as the instrument of their death. The discipline of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, never strong, disintegrated completely once the shooting started. The men did not fire in controlled volleys. They fired at will, pumping rounds into anything that moved. They fired into the crowd, they fired into the lodges, and they fired at the dogs running through the camp. The excitement of the slaughter took over. Men shouted and cheered as they saw their targets fall. The smoke from the black powder hung low in the freezing air, creating a haze that made target identification difficult. In the confusion, soldiers fired across the circle, hitting their own comrades on the opposite side of the village. The friendly fire, casualties did not slow the rate of fire. They only added to the frenzy. The women and children, realizing that standing by the flag was a death sentence, began to run. They scattered in all directions. Some ran toward the pony herd, hoping to catch a mount, but the soldiers cut them down. Others ran toward the high bluffs, trying to scramble up the steep slopes, but they were picked off by the marksmen on the ridge. The only cover available was the dry creek bed itself. The banks of Sand Creek were high and steep, offering a measure of protection from the direct fire. The mass of refugees turned toward the creek, sliding down the sandbanks, dragging their wounded with them. The scene in the village became a nightmare of close-quarters violence. The soldiers, seeing the people flee, charged down into the camp. They rode their horses between the lodges, firing their revolvers at point-blank range. They shot women who were trying to shield their children. They shot the elderly who were too slow to run. The bloodless third was washing itself in blood. The pent-up aggression of the 100 days, the anger over the Hungate family, the misery of the freezing march. It all poured out of the barrels of their guns. Black Kettle, seeing his wife struck by bullets, she was hit 9 times but miraculously survived the initial volley, managed to get her and himself into the creek bed. He had abandoned the flag. It stood alone in the center of the deserted gathering spot, riddled with bullet holes, waving over the bodies of those who had trusted it. The symbol of the United States flew over a scene that violated every principle the nation claimed to uphold. The soldiers began to dismount to finish the work. They moved through the lodges, lifting the entrance flaps and firing into the dark interiors to kill anyone hiding inside. They found women huddled under buffalo robes and shot them. They found children hiding behind piles of firewood and shot them. The orders Chivington had given, "Nits make lice," were being carried out with a literal interpretation. There was no hesitation to kill the young. Captain Silas Soule and his company of the 1st Colorado Cavalry sat on their horses, watching the horror unfold. Soule had ordered his men not to fire. They held their formation, their weapons cold, witnesses to the atrocity. They saw the volunteers of the 3rd running wild, scalping the dead and the dying. They saw soldiers cutting trophies from the bodies. Soule's refusal to participate was a silent scream of protest, but it could not stop the momentum of 700 other men who had lost their humanity. Chivington rode past Soule, screaming at him, asking why he wasn't firing. Soule looked at the colonel and did not move. The divide between the soldier and the murderer was drawn in the snow that morning. The noise was a cacophony of violence. The deep boom of the howitzers, the sharp crack of the carbines, the dull thud of the muskets, the screaming of the horses, and the wailing of the people created a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The air smelled of sulfur and blood, a metallic tang that overpowered the smell of the wood smoke. The snow in the village, pristine white minutes before, was now trampled into a muddy slush, stained pink and red. One soldier, a volunteer from the 3rd, dismounted and knelt to get a better shot at a woman running with a child. He took his time, aiming his rifle. He fired, and the woman fell. He reloaded and fired again, hitting the child. He stood up, satisfied, and looked for another target. This calculated, cold-blooded execution was repeated across the field. The anonymity of the mob allowed the men to commit acts they would never have dreamed of in Denver. Here on the freezing plains there was no law but the gun. The confusion among the Arapaho and Cheyenne was total. They had no plan for this. They had no defensive positions. They were reacting with the raw instinct of survival. Warriors who had managed to grab their weapons fought back desperately to buy time for their families. They took cover behind the lodges or in the brush, firing arrows and the few bullets they had at the blue coats. A few soldiers fell, knocked from their saddles, but the resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. The overwhelming firepower of the army swept over them like a tide. As the sun fully breached the horizon, it illuminated the scale of the massacre. The village was being systematically destroyed. The soldiers were setting fire to the lodges. The flames roared up, consuming the buffalo hides and the possessions of the families. The heat from the burning teepees melted the snow around them, creating pools of water that turned to steam. The black smoke from the fires mixed with the white smoke of the gunpowder, rising into the clear blue sky in a thick choking column that could be seen for miles. The attack had devolved from a military engagement into a hunt. The soldiers were chasing individuals down. They were riding down women in the open snow. They were clubbing the wounded with the butts of their rifles. The restraint of civilization had snapped completely. The men of the Third were competing with each other for scalps. They were cutting fingers off bodies to take rings. They were mutilating the dead in ways that defied description, acts of savagery that they projected onto the natives but enacted themselves. The flow of the battle shifted toward the creek bed. The survivors who had made it to the edge of the camp threw themselves over the bank. They scrambled into the sand, digging with their hands, trying to create pits to hide in. The soldiers lined the top of the banks, looking down into the depression. The killing field moved from the village to the creek. The village behind them was a ruin of burning lodges and bodies. The flag on the lodge pole still stood, flapping in the wind, casting a shadow over the corpse of white antelope. The sheer volume of ammunition expended in those first 30 minutes was staggering. The soldiers fired thousands of rounds. The ground was littered with brass casings and paper cartridges. The air was so thick with smoke that men wrapped scarves around their faces to breathe. The recoil of the heavy muskets bruised the shoulders of the volunteers, but they didn't feel it. They were drunk on the violence. Chivington remained in command of the chaos, urging his men forward. He did not attempt to restore order or stop the killing of non-combatants. He encouraged it. He wanted a total victory, a complete erasure of the people in the valley. He rode his large horse through the burning village, a giant figure in the smoke, directing the artillery to fire on the groups fleeing up the creek. The initial charge had been a success in terms of surprise and brutality. The camp was broken. The cohesion of the tribes was shattered. The peace chiefs were dead or fleeing. The sanctuary had become a slaughterhouse. But the killing was not over. The survivors were trapped in the creek bed, and the soldiers were repositioning to finish them off. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the tragedy, shining brightly on the red snow. The day was just beginning, and the work of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry was far from done. The silence of the night had been replaced by the roar of a massacre that would echo through history. The sun climbed higher into the winter sky, casting a stark, unmerciful light over the valley of Big Sandy Creek. The initial chaotic charge through the village had fractured the Cheyenne and Arapaho families into scattered groups, but the geography of the land dictated their movement. The dry creek bed winding along the edge of the camp offered the only immediate cover from the cavalrymen who were riding down anyone caught in the open. The banks of the creek ranged from 2 to 10 feet high, carved by seasonal floods into steep, sandy walls. It was into this depression that the survivors poured, sliding down the embankments in a desperate bid to put the earth between themselves and the carbines of the 3rd Colorado. The transition from the burning village to the creek bed changed the nature of the engagement. It shifted from a cavalry charge to a siege. Hundreds of natives, men, women, and children, found themselves trapped in a linear kill zone. The soldiers, realizing the enemy had gone to ground, adjusted their tactics. They did not ride into the creek bed where the footing was poor and the quarters too close. Instead, they lined the tops of the banks on both sides. They dismounted, formed skirmish lines, and began to fire down into the mass of humanity below. The creek bed became a shooting gallery. The soldiers had the high ground, the ammunition, and the initiative. The families in the creek had only the sand. The desperation in the creek bed drove the people to dig. They used anything they had. Men used their knives to hack at the frozen earth near the base of the banks. Women used their hands, clawing at the sand until their fingers bled. They used driftwood, rib bones from carcasses, and rocks. They burrowed into the sides of the banks, creating shallow caves or pits that could shelter a few people at a time. These sand pits became the defining feature of the battle's second phase. The people pressed themselves into the cold dirt, piling sand in front of the openings to stop the bullets. The soldiers on the banks poured a withering fire into the creek. The range was point blank, often less than 50 yards. A soldier would step to the edge of the bank, fire his weapon into the huddle of bodies below, and step back to reload. The smoke from hundreds of black powder weapons drifted down into the creek, settling in the low ground. The air in the pits became thick and acrid, burning the eyes and throats of those hiding inside. The sound was deafening. The boom of the large-bore muskets echoed off the creek walls, amplifying the noise until it was a continuous roar. Colonel Chivington, seeing that the rifle fire alone was not dislodging the defenders rapidly enough, ordered the artillery to be brought forward. The battery of 12-pound mountain howitzers was maneuvered to the edge of the creek. The gunners struggled to position the heavy carriages in the snow, aiming the muzzles down into the wash. The deployment of artillery against entrenched infantry is devastating. Against civilians hiding in dirt holes, it was an act of industrial slaughter. The gunners loaded the cannons with spherical case shot and canister. When the howitzers fired, the ground shook. The canister rounds acted like giant shotgun blasts, spraying hundreds of iron balls into the creek bed. The balls ripped through the brush, churned up the sand, and tore through flesh. The confined space of the creek magnified the effect. There was nowhere to run. If a shell landed in a pit, it killed everyone inside. The explosions threw geysers of sand and snow into the air, mixed with red mist. The gun crews worked with a mechanical rhythm: sponge, load, aim, fire. They adjusted their elevation to walk the fire up and down the length of the creek, systematically targeting the pockets of resistance. Inside the pits, the conditions were horrific. George Bent, the half-Cheyenne son of the trader William Bent, was among those trapped. He had been in the village when the attack started and had retreated to the creek. He lay in a pit, suffering from a severe wound to his hip where a bullet had smashed the bone. Around him, the dead were piled up to protect the living. The bodies of the fallen were dragged to the front of the pits to serve as sandbags. The cold was intense, freezing the blood that pooled on the floor of the dugouts. The survivors pressed themselves into the dirt, listening to the thud of bullets hitting the earth inches from their heads. The resistance from the pits was sporadic but fierce. The warriors who had weapons fired back at the silhouettes on the skyline. They had to be careful with their ammunition. They waited for a soldier to expose himself too much, then fired. Several soldiers were hit, tumbling down the banks into the creek where they were finished off or left to bleed. But the return fire was a drop in the bucket compared to the volume coming from the rims. The soldiers had supply wagons full of ammunition. The warriors had only what was in their pouches. The fighting dragged on for hours. The sun moved across the sky, offering no warmth. The bloodless third was proving its name was a misnomer. They jeered at the people in the holes. They rolled heavy rocks down the banks to crush those hiding below. They taunted the women. The discipline that had been absent in the charge was replaced by a cruel patience. They were content to pin the families down and pick them off one by one. Major Anthony, the commander of Fort Lyon, who had promised safety to these people, was present at the creek. He directed the fire of his men. He did not call for a ceasefire. He did not ask for surrender. The objective was extermination. The soldiers fired at movement. A hand reaching out to pull a body back was a target. A child trying to crawl to a new position was a target. The dehumanization was absolute. The enemy was not viewed as human. They were treated as vermin to be dug out of the earth. The topography of the creek allowed for enfilade fire. The creek twisted and turned, meaning that soldiers positioned on a bend could fire down the length of a straight section, catching the defenders from the side. The howitzers were moved repeatedly to exploit these angles. The gunners sought positions where they could fire directly into the mouths of the caves. When they found such an angle, the result was carnage. A single shell could clear a pit, leaving nothing but mangled remains. As the afternoon wore on, the thirst became a torture for the wounded. The water in the creek was frozen or turned to mud by the trampling. The survivors sucked on ice or snow stained with gunpowder residue. The cries of the wounded children pierced the lulls in the firing, a sound that drove some of the mothers to acts of suicidal desperation. A few women charged out of the pits, wielding knives, choosing to die fighting rather than wait for the inevitable shell. They were cut down before they could reach the banks. One particular defensive position, held by a group of dog soldiers who had refused to retreat further, held out for a significant time. They had dug deep into a high bank, creating a fortress of earth. They kept the soldiers at bay with accurate arrow fire and rifle shots. Chivington concentrated his forces on this strong point. He ordered the artillery to blast it point blank. The shells hammered the bank, collapsing the roof of the dugout, burying the warriors alive or forcing them out into the open where the carbines were waiting. The sheer weight of metal thrown at the defenders made heroism irrelevant. It was a mathematical equation of ballistics and geology. The scene along the creek extended for over a mile. It was not a single battle, but a series of isolated massacres. In one section, a group of 30 people was cornered in a washout. The soldiers surrounded the rim, firing down until there was no movement. Then they climbed down to take their trophies. The scalping continued here in the creek bed with even more fervor than in the village. The soldiers took scalps from the dead, from the wounded, and from the very young. They cut off fingers and ears. The mutilation was a ritual of dominance, a way to permanently mark their victory over the savages. The cold played a critical role in the lethality of the siege. The wounded, unable to move and losing blood, succumbed to hypothermia rapidly. The temperature prevented the blood from clotting properly in some cases, or froze the wounds shut in others. The shock of the cold combined with the shock of the trauma killed many who might have survived the initial bullet. The creek bed was a refrigerator for the dead. The soldiers of the 3rd, many of whom had been shivering on the march, were now sweating from the exertion and the adrenaline. They walked along the banks, reloading their weapons with black powder-stained hands. They laughed and joked, calling out scores. The disconnect between the reality of what they were doing and their perception of it was total. They saw themselves as avengers, heroes punishing the wicked. They did not see the mothers shielding their infants. They saw a threat to the territory being neutralized. Captain Soule and his company, still refusing to fire, moved along the periphery of the action. They witnessed the bombardment of the pits. They saw the howitzers blowing bodies apart. Soule's presence was a silent condemnation, but he was powerless to stop the machinery of the slaughter. Chivington ignored him now, focused entirely on the destruction of the pits. The colonel was riding back and forth, ensuring that no group was overlooked. He wanted a complete count. The warriors in the pits fought with the knowledge that there would be no prisoners. They had seen what happened in the village. They knew that surrender meant death. This knowledge gave their resistance a terrifying clarity. They were fighting only to take a soldier with them. They conserved their arrows. They waited for the blue coats to get careless. A lieutenant from the 1st Regiment was shot through the chest while peering over the bank. A private from the 3rd was hit in the neck. These casualties infuriated the attackers further, leading to even more indiscriminate fire. The smoke hanging in the creek bed grew denser as the day progressed. It limited visibility, turning the battle into a fight against shadows. The soldiers fired at muzzle flashes or at sounds. The people in the pits huddled in the darkness of their caves, choking on the fumes. The vibration of the impacts dislodged sand from the roofs of the dugouts, threatening to bury them. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. As the sun began to dip towards the west, the intensity of the fire slackened slightly, only because the soldiers were running low on ammunition or becoming exhausted. They had been awake for over 30 hours, marching and killing. But the siege did not break. The cordon remained tight. The howitzers continued to fire intermittently, punctuating the afternoon with destruction. The creek bed, once a place of shelter during storms, had become a mass grave. The bodies in the creek lay in tangled heaps. The sand was soaked with blood, freezing into a dark, concrete-like substance. The water in the pools was red. The white snow on the banks was trampled in gray. The pristine landscape of the morning was gone, replaced by the ugly debris of war. Cartridge papers, broken arrows, dead horses, and the shattered bodies of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Some survivors managed to escape by crawling north up the creek bed, moving only when the smoke obscured them or when the soldiers were distracted. They moved inches at a time, dragging their wounded bodies over the frozen sand. They headed for the open plains, away from the kill zone, facing a 50-mile trek in freezing weather with no clothing, no food, and no horses. But for the majority, there was no escape. They remained in the pits, waiting for the dark or for the end. The siege of the sand pits demonstrated the industrial nature of the massacre. It was not a warrior's battle of charge and countercharge. It was a systematic process of using superior technology and position to eradicate a trapped population. The howitzer shells did the work that the carbines could not. The geography that the tribes thought would save them became the walls of their prison. The promise of the high banks turned into a trap. By late afternoon, the firing became desultory. The soldiers began to venture down into the creek bed in larger numbers, checking the pits. They fired into the bodies to ensure they were dead. They finished off the wounded who were still breathing. The looting began in earnest. Buffalo robes were pulled from the dead to keep the soldiers warm. Ornaments were stripped. The intimate violence of the aftermath played out in the bloody sand. The sun touched the horizon, signaling the approach of another freezing night. The battle of the sand pits was winding down, not because of a surrender, but because there were few left to kill in the targeted sections. The silence began to return to the valley, but it was a heavy, loaded silence, broken by the moans of the dying who had been missed and the triumphant shouts of the soldiers collecting their gruesome souvenirs. The dawn had brought the attack, but the day had brought the grinding reality of the siege. The creek bed held the secrets of the day, buried in the sand and the snow, a testament to the relentless force that had been unleashed upon the peace camp. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the valley floor as the winter sun began its final descent behind the western ridges. The organized volleys of the morning and the systematic bombardment of the afternoon had ceased, replaced by the sporadic sharp cracks of individual executions. The main battle was effectively over. The Cheyenne and Arapaho resistance had been crushed by the sheer weight of numbers and artillery, leaving the 3rd Colorado Cavalry in possession of a landscape that had been transformed into a charnel house. The mission objective had shifted from military engagement to the grim business of trophy hunting and looting. The smoke from the burning lodges hung low and heavy in the freezing air, a thick blanket that trapped the stench of singed hair, burnt buffalo hide, and fresh blood against the frozen earth. The soldiers of the 3rd, now released from the tension of the fight, moved across the killing field with a predator's leisure. They dismounted and walked among the bodies that littered the sand of the creek bed and the trampled snow of the village. The cold was biting, causing the blood on their uniforms to stiffen and crack. But the men seemed impervious to the temperature, fueled by an adrenaline that had curdled into a dark frenzy. They were not looking for survivors to offer medical aid. They were looking for victims to finish off and bodies to despoil. The orders to take no prisoners were being interpreted with a horrifying literalism. The mutilation of the dead began in earnest. It was not the work of a few rogue individuals, but a widespread collective act of the regiment. Men drew their skinning knives, the blades dulled by the day's work, and stooped over the corpses. They took scalps not as military proof, but as macabre souvenirs. They did not limit themselves to the hair. The soldiers cut off fingers to retrieve silver rings that were swollen tight on the hands of the dead. They severed ears to take earrings. The brutality was specific and gendered. The bodies of the women were subjected to grotesque violations. Soldiers cut out private parts, stretching them over their saddle bows or sticking them onto their hats as ornaments. They laughed and compared their prizes, holding up the bloody trophies in the fading light. This was not the heat of battle. This was the cold, calculated dismantling of human beings. The looting of the village proceeded simultaneously. The lodges that had not yet been fully consumed by fire were ransacked. The soldiers dragged out buffalo robes, which were valuable commodities on the frontier market. They took beaded moccasins, painted quivers, and dried meat. They smashed what they could not carry. The pottery was stomped into the mud. The winter supplies of the tribe, sacks of flour, bundles of dried fruit, and bladders of pemmican were scattered or confiscated. The wealth of the band accumulated through years of labor and trade was stripped away in minutes. The soldiers tied the bundles of stolen goods to their saddles, turning their military mounts into pack animals laden with plunder. In the center of the devastation, a small group of prisoners had been gathered, a rare exception to the general slaughter. Among them was the wife of the trader William Bent, Yellow Woman, and the half-breed son of John Smith, Jack Smith. Jack was well known to many of the soldiers and the citizens of Denver. He sat on the ground, his hands bound, surrounded by men who looked at him with a mixture of recognition and hatred. The soldiers of the 3rd despised the half-breeds almost as much as the full-blood natives, viewing them as spies and traitors who straddled the line between civilization and savagery. The treatment of Jack Smith exemplified the lawlessness of the evening. He was under the nominal protection of the officers, but that protection was a paper shield. A soldier walked up to Jack Smith, placed a revolver against his side, and fired. Smith slumped forward, mortally wounded. The officers nearby did not arrest the shooter. They barely acknowledged the act. It was a summary execution of a prisoner within the lines of a United States military encampment, and it passed without comment. The hatred was so pervasive that the murder of a captive was seen as a housekeeping measure rather than a crime. Colonel Chivington rode through the aftermath, observing the work of his men. He did not reprimand the soldiers for the mutilations. He did not order them to stop looting. He viewed the destruction as the total victory he had promised the people of Denver. The carnage was the proof of his success. He stopped to look at the bodies of the chiefs. The corpse of White Antelope lay where he had fallen early in the fight. The soldiers had stripped him. He lay naked in the snow, his body riddled with bullets and mutilated. His peace medal, the silver disc bearing the face of the president, had been taken as a trophy. Chivington looked down at the old man who had sued for peace and saw only a dead enemy. The scene near the artillery positions was one of industrial cool-down. The gunners swabbed out the blackened barrels of the howitzers. The bronze tubes were hot to the touch. The ground around the guns was piled with debris, spent friction primers, torn flannel powder bags, and the wooden crates that had held the ammunition. The crews looked down into the creek bed where their shells had done the most damage. The sand pits were silent now, save for the occasional groan of a dying person buried under the collapsed banks. The gunners did not go down to check their work. They simply prepared the guns for travel, hitching the tired horses back to the limbers. Captain Silas Soule and his company of the 1st Colorado Cavalry remained separate from the looting. They had refused to fire during the day, and they refused to join the carnival of horrors in the evening. They sat on their horses or stood in tight groups watching the volunteers of the 3rd. The tension between the two groups was palpable. The men of the 3rd, covered in blood and laden with loot, jeered at the firststers, calling them cowards and women. Soule's men watched in silence, their faces grim. They were witnessing crimes that they knew they would have to testify to later. They saw the specific faces of the men committing the atrocities. They memorized the events, storing the horror for the inquiries that would inevitably follow. As twilight deepened into night, the temperature dropped precipitously. The wet uniforms of the soldiers began to freeze hard. The blood on their hands turned to dark, flaky crusts. The fires of the burning lodges provided the only light, casting flickering orange glows against the smoke. The soldiers began to set up their own bivouacs near the battlefield. They used the wood from the unburnt teepees for their campfires. They sat on the stolen buffalo robes. They cooked the captured beef and ate the dried meat taken from the Indian stores. The victors feasted on the supplies of the vanquished while the bodies of the owners lay stiffening a few yards away. The soldiers' encampment, situated just upstream from the ruined village, took on a surreal, almost festive atmosphere that clashed violently with the surrounding carnage. The men of the 3rd, having secured the area, began to relax into the rhythms of a hunting camp. They dragged whole carcasses of the ponies they had shot earlier near the fires, carving off massive steaks of horse meat to roast alongside the captured buffalo beef. The grease from the cooking meat dripped into the flames, sizzling and popping, sending up a savory aroma that mixed grotesquely with the stench of death. They sat on the stolen buffalo robes, some of them wearing the beaded headdresses they had taken from the bodies of the elders. Mocking the culture they had just destroyed, one group of volunteers from Company F gathered around a large fire, passing a bottle of trade whiskey they had found in a lodge. They were engaged in a contest of storytelling, each man trying to outdo the other with the details of his kills. One man pulled a fresh scalp from his belt, a long braided lock of black hair with the skin still wet with blood, and slapped it against his thigh, claiming it belonged to a chief. His comrades cheered and drank, the firelight illuminating their faces, which were smeared with soot and dirt. The normalization of the atrocity was complete. The scalp was no longer a piece of a human being, but a currency of status within the unit. The specific nature of the trophies taken by the soldiers revealed a deep psychological need to dominate and humiliate the enemy. It wasn't just scalps. Soldiers had cut the trigger fingers off the warriors, a symbolic act to ensure they could never fire a weapon again, even in the afterlife. They took the medicine bags, sacred pouches containing personal totems, and ripped them open, scattering the contents in the snow or keeping them as oddities. They took the dolls of the children, small figures made of buckskin and horsehair, and tied them to their saddles next to the bloody knives. This pilfering of the intimate and the sacred stripped the victims of their identity, reducing them to a collection of objects to be owned by the conqueror. The horses of the regiment, tethered in picket lines on the edge of the camp, were restless. They could smell the blood and the predators. They stomped and snorted, their eyes rolling white in the darkness. The soldiers had to constantly reassure them, walking the lines and checking the ropes. The presence of the dead ponies, hundreds of them lying stiff in the snow, seemed to spook the living animals. The equine casualties were a silent testament to the indiscriminate nature of the fire. The soldiers had shot the mounts as readily as the riders to prevent escape. Down in the creek bed, the cold was doing the work that the bullets had started. The temperature had fallen to near 10 degrees below zero. The sand, damp with blood, and the water from the melted snow froze into a concrete hard surface. The bodies that had been pliable in the afternoon were now rigid statues frozen in the contorted positions of their final moments. A woman's hand reached up from a pile of drift sand. The fingers splayed in a silent plea, now turned to ice. The frost settled on the eyelashes of the dead children, giving them a serene, glittering appearance that belied the violence of their end. Chivington remained awake late into the night. He sat by his command fire, dictating notes to his adjutant. He was already crafting the narrative that would be sent to Denver and Washington. In his mind, and soon on paper, the village of refugees became a stronghold of hostiles. The women and children became warriors. The defense of the sandpits became a desperate counterattack. He was inflating the numbers of the enemy and deflating the numbers of the non-combatants. He was building the wall of lies that would protect his reputation. He looked at the fire, satisfied. He had done what he said he would do. He had killed Indians. The specifics of age or gender were details that he chose to ignore in the grand calculus of his ambition. The few soldiers who wandered away from the fires to relieve themselves found the darkness oppressive. The silence of the plains was vast and heavy. But close to the creek, there were sounds that made even the hardest men pause. The faint, rhythmic death rattle of a lung-shot warrior who refused to die. The soft crying of an infant that had somehow survived the cold and the bullets, hidden deep in a burrow, calling for a mother who was already dead. Some soldiers, hearing these sounds, walked back to the fire and drank more whiskey to drown them out. Others, more ruthless, walked toward the sounds with their revolvers drawn, eager to silence the noise so they could sleep. A single shot would ring out, followed by silence, and the soldier would return to the warmth, his duty done. The sounds of the night were grotesque. The wounded ponies that had not been killed screamed in the darkness. The wolves and coyotes, attracted by the scent of death that drifted for miles on the wind, began to gather on the periphery of the light, their eyes reflecting the campfires. Occasionally, a gunshot would ring out as a sentry fired at a movement in the creek or finished off a wounded survivor who had crawled out of a hole. The soldiers sang songs, drunk on the violence and the whiskey that had appeared from the saddlebags. They reenacted the kills, bragging about the shots they had made, pantomiming the scalping. In the creek bed, under the cover of the absolute dark, the few survivors who had feigned death or hidden deep in the caves began to move. They were ghosts in their own home. They crawled over the bodies of their kin. They stifled their coughs. They moved with agonizing slowness, inching toward the open plains to the north. They had no food, no weapons, and often no clothing. They were moving into a frozen void, pursued by the fear that the soldiers would return at first light. Every snap of a twig sounded like a cannon shot to their ears. The sheer scale of the plunder became evident as the soldiers sorted their loot by the firelight. There were hundreds of buffalo robes, piles of moccasins, and stacks of buffalo meat. There were personal items, mirrors, combs, and tools. The soldiers traded these items among themselves, establishing a market value for the stolen heritage of the Cheyenne. A robe was worth $10, a scalp was worth a round of drinks. The commodification of the massacre happened instantly. The physical evidence of the tribe's existence was being packed into saddlebags to be sold in Denver as curiosities. The body count was impossible to determine accurately in the dark, but the ground was thick with the dead. Estimates would later range from 150 to 500. But on that night, it felt like a generation had been wiped out. The majority were women and children. The soldiers stepped over the small bodies without hesitation. The dehumanization propaganda had worked perfectly. They did not see dead children. They saw dead nits. The moral barrier that usually protects the young and the helpless in warfare had been obliterated by the rhetoric of extermination. Chivington sent out riders to recall the detachments that had chased the fleeing natives onto the plains. These men returned to the main camp in groups of 2 or 3, their horses blown and foaming. They brought more scalps and more stories. They reported that they had chased the runners for miles, shooting them down like antelope. They had left a trail of bodies stretching out onto the prairie. The encirclement had not been perfect, but the pursuit had been relentless. The medical staff of the regiment had little to do for the enemy. There were no triage stations for the Arapaho. The surgeons attended to the few soldiers who had been wounded by the desperate return fire or by their own clumsy handling of weapons. The ratio of casualties was staggeringly lopsided. For every soldier with a scratch, there were 10 dead natives. The medical tent was a place of whiskey and rough bandages for the victors, while the wounded natives froze to death in the sand. The smell of the battlefield changed as the night wore on. The metallic scent of fresh blood gave way to the heavy, cloying odor of burnt flesh and decay. The fire smoldered, sending up plumes of acrid smoke that stung the lungs. The wind shifted, blowing the smoke back over the soldiers' camp, forcing them to move or cough into their blankets. It was as if the land itself was trying to choke them with the evidence of their deeds. Among the loot, soldiers found letters and documents in the lodge of Black Kettle. These were safe conduct passes signed by various military commanders, attesting to the chief's peaceful intent and good character. The soldiers read them and laughed, tossing the papers into the fire. The written word of the government promising safety was used as kindling to warm the men who had violated it. The destruction of these documents was a symbolic erasure of the treaty obligations. The stars came out, cold and distant diamonds in the black sky. They looked down on a scene that defied the romantic notions of the West. There was no glory here. There was no brave charge against a fortified enemy. There was only the aftermath of a mechanized riot. The silence of the dead in the creek bed grew louder than the noise of the camp. The absence of the voices that had filled the village 24 hours earlier, the children playing, the women talking, the dogs barking, was a void that the soldiers filled with their drunken clamor. Sol and his officers huddled together away from the main fires. They spoke in low tones, discussing what they would do when they returned to Fort Lyon. They knew that Chivington would paint this as a great victory. They knew the newspapers in Denver would hail the Third as heroes. They realized the burden of truth would fall on them. They were the only ones who saw the white flag. They were the only ones who saw the women pleading for mercy. The weight of this knowledge sat heavy on their shoulders, heavier than the cold. The night of November 29th was the transition point. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry had completed its transformation from a ragged volunteer unit to a force of executioners. They had blooded themselves. They had followed orders to the letter and beyond. They slept that night with the spoils of war under their heads, convinced of their righteousness. They did not dream of the horrors they had inflicted. They slept the deep sleep of the exhausted laborer who feels he has done a good day's work. But in the darkness of the creek, the few sparks of life that remained flickered and faded. A wounded warrior buried under sand breathed his last. A child, hidden in a hole, froze into stillness. The final casualties of the day were claimed not by bullets, but by the indifference of the night. The field of slaughter settled into a frozen tableau, a monument to the failure of humanity that would stain the history of the territory forever. The sun had set on a massacre, and the long night of the aftermath had begun, hiding the faces of the dead but unable to hide the truth of how they died. December 22nd, 1864. The return of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry to Denver was not a military maneuver. It was a triumphal procession that rivaled the conquests of ancient Rome, though the spoils displayed were not gold and marble but the severed parts of human beings. The regiment rode into the city under a sky that was bright and cold, the winter sun glinting off the brass buttons of their uniforms and the polished metal of their weapons. The citizens of Denver, who had spent the summer and autumn in a state of manufactured terror, poured into the streets to welcome their saviors. The relief was palpable. The shops closed, the saloons threw open their doors, and the sidewalks were packed with cheering men, women, and children who waved handkerchiefs and flags. The soldiers rode with a swagger that belied the ragged condition of their mounts. They had survived the 100 days. They had marched through the snow and the freezing nights. Now, they were back in civilization, and they brought with them the tangible proof of their success. The evidence was not hidden in saddlebags. It was displayed with a grotesque pride. Dangling from the saddlebows, draped over the pommels and stuck onto the ends of lodge poles carried like lances were the fresh scalps of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The hair of the victims, long black braids, silver-gray locks of the elders, and the fine, soft hair of the children swayed with the rhythm of the horses. The blood had dried into dark, stiff crusts, but the horror was fresh. Colonel John Chivington rode at the head of the column, absorbing the adulation. He was the hero of the hour. The local newspapers, the Rocky Mountain News foremost among them, had already printed the initial reports of the Battle of Sand Creek, describing it as a brilliant masterstroke against a savage enemy. Chivington saluted the crowd, his massive frame dominating the scene. He had delivered the vengeance the city had demanded after the Hungate panic. He had wiped out the threat. The cheers that washed over him were the validation of his political and military ambitions. The procession moved toward the Apollo Theater, the social hub of the city. The celebration that followed was a descent into a macabre carnival. The soldiers dismounted and mingled with the populace, eager to show off their trophies. They held up the scalps for inspection. Men in suits and women in fine dresses leaned in to look closely at the grisly artifacts. The disconnect between the trappings of Victorian civilization, the brick buildings, the carriages, the fashion, and the raw, butchered remains of the natives was absolute. The citizens did not recoil in disgust. They gasped in admiration. They touched the hair. They listened to the stories of how the Red Devils were dispatched. The dehumanization was so complete that the scalp of a 5-year-old child was viewed as a pest control trophy rather than a crime scene. Inside the theater, the atmosphere was electric. The air smelled of cigar smoke, stale beer, and the unwashed wool of the soldiers. Chivington took the stage to a thunderous ovation. He spoke of the engagement with the rhetoric of a crusader. He described the charge, the artillery fire, and the bravery of his men. He omitted the white flag. He omitted the sand pits filled with women. He painted a picture of a fierce battle against entrenched warriors who fought with desperation. The audience hung on every word, cheering at the descriptions of the carnage. During the intermission of the performance, the trophies were strung up across the stage. A rope was stretched from one side of the proscenium to the other, and the scalps were tied to it, creating a curtain of hair. The audience stared at the display. It was the physical manifestation of their safety. If these scalps were here hanging in the theater, then the owners were dead and the trails were safe. The logic was simple and brutal. The bloodless third was bloodless no more. They were the toasts of the town. However, amidst the celebration, a countercurrent of truth began to flow, originating from the men of the 1st Colorado Cavalry who had refused to participate in the slaughter. Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer did not join the festivities at the Apollo. They were sickened by what they had witnessed. They knew that the battle was a massacre of friendly natives under the protection of the flag. They knew that the warriors described by Chivington were largely women and children. They realized that if the official narrative went unchallenged, the stain on the honor of the uniform would be permanent. Soule sat down to write. He wrote a letter to Major Edward Wincoop, the former commander of Fort Lyon, who was then at Fort Riley, Kansas. His handwriting was hurried, driven by anger and the need to record the facts before they could be buried. He detailed the atrocities with a forensic clarity. He described the mutilations, the shooting of toddlers, and the specific orders given by Chivington. He wrote that it was hard to see little children on their knees begging for their lives, to have their brains beaten out like dogs. This letter was an act of profound courage. In the climate of Denver, where Chivington was a god, contradicting the victory was akin to treason. Soule knew he was marking himself as a target. Lieutenant Kramer wrote a similar letter to Major Scott Anthony, who had been complicit but was now distancing himself slightly as the political winds began to shift. Kramer told Anthony that he would not have been an officer in such a mess for the whole world. These letters were slipped into the mail, bypassing the censorship that Chivington had tried to impose. They traveled east, carried by the very stagecoaches that the war was supposed to protect. When these accounts reached the east, the reaction was drastically different from the jubilation in Denver. The United States was still in the grip of the Civil War, but the details of Sand Creek shocked the conscience of the politicians and the military brass in Washington. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs read the reports with horror. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, a powerful congressional body established to oversee the Union war effort, turned its gaze toward the Colorado Territory. The narrative began to fracture. The story of a gallant victory crumbled under the weight of the specific gruesome details provided by Soule and Kramer. In January 1865, the mood in Denver began to sour. Rumors of a federal investigation circulated. The celebratory banquets for the 3rd Regiment stopped. The citizens, realizing that their heroes were being branded as butchers by the national press, became defensive. They lashed out at the Indian lovers in the East who did not understand the realities of the frontier. But the wheels of the inquiry were turning. The military commission convened at Fort Lyon and later in Denver to investigate the conduct of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. The hearings were tense, conducted in rooms filled with armed men who hated each other. Chivington, who mustered out on January 6, 1865 to avoid a court-martial, appeared not as a defendant but as a witness, though his actions were the focus of the proceedings. He was aggressive, defiant, and unrepentant. He attacked the character of the witnesses who spoke against him. He claimed that Soule and the others were cowards or liars. Captain Silas Soule was the star witness for the prosecution. He walked into the inquiry room knowing that his life was in danger. The veterans of the 3rd viewed him as a traitor who was trying to rob them about their glory. Soule took the stand and testified under oath. He spoke calmly and precisely. He recounted the white flag. He recounted the lack of resistance. He described the specific acts of mutilation he had seen his fellow soldiers commit. His testimony was devastating because it came from a man who had a reputation for bravery, a man who had infiltrated Confederate lines earlier in the war. He could not be dismissed as a coward. The testimony of the other soldiers corroborated Soule. They described the killing of Jack Smith. They described the looting. They described the trophies. The transcript of the investigation grew into a litany of horrors. The term massacre began to replace battle in the official record. The investigators visited the site at Sand Creek. They found the remains of the village. They found the skeletons of the victims still scattered in the creek bed, stripped of flesh by the wolves but still bearing the marks of the violence. The physical evidence supported Soule. The fallout was political and immediate. Governor Evans, who had authorized the circulars and stoked the panic, was removed from office. He was seen as the architect of the environment that allowed the massacre to happen. Chivington, though he escaped criminal prosecution due to his resignation, was ruined. His political aspirations were incinerated. He spent the rest of his life drifting from place to place, trying to justify his actions. But he died a man marked by disgrace. The tragedy of the aftermath was not limited to careers. In April 1865, shortly after testifying, Captain Silas Soule was walking the streets of Denver. He was acting as the provost marshal. He was ambushed. Two soldiers of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, Charles Squire and William Morrow, shot him dead in Denver on April 23, 1865. The assassination was a direct reprisal for his testimony. Soule paid the ultimate price for his truth. His murder sent a chilling message to anyone who dared to oppose the hardline faction, but it also cemented his legacy as the moral center of the event. The inquiry concluded with a damning report. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War issued a statement that was blistering in its condemnation. It stated that Chivington had deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of his cruelty. The government formally repudiated the actions of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. The Treaty of the Little Arkansas, signed later in 1865, acknowledged the gross and wanton outrages committed at Sand Creek and promised reparations to the survivors, though the promise of payment would remain largely unfulfilled for generations. Back in Denver, the scalps disappeared from the theater. The parade stopped. The soldiers of the 3rd took off their uniforms and returned to the mines and the ranches. They did not speak of the scalps as loudly as they had in December. The victory had become a liability. They buried the trophies or hid them in trunks, the physical evidence of their crime becoming a secret shame rather than a public boast. The impact on the tribes was catastrophic. The peace chiefs were dead. The survivors who had escaped the creek bed had made the freezing trek to the Smoky Hill River, joining the dog soldiers in the hostile bands. They told the story of the white flag and the slaughter. The massacre did not end the Indian Wars. It ignited them with a new ferocity. The Cheyenne and Arapaho, convinced that no peace was possible with a people who killed women and children under a flag of truce, went on a war of retaliation that set the plains on fire for the next decade. The trust was broken forever. In the years that followed, the site of the massacre lay silent. The wind blew through the cottonwoods along the Big Sandy. The bones of the dead were slowly covered by the shifting sand and the grass. The location became a place of ghosts, avoided by the tribes and ignored by the settlers. But the event refused to die. It remained an open wound in the history of the West. The narrative of Sand Creek shifted from a story of conquest to a story of atrocity. It became the defining example of the darker side of manifest destiny. The parade of scalps in the Apollo Theater remained the most searing image of the event's aftermath. A moment when a civilized city looked into the mirror and saw a monster and cheered. As the 19th century wound down, the veterans of the 3rd Colorado grew old. Some maintained to their dying breath that they had done the right thing, that nits make lice. Others drank themselves into oblivion, trying to forget the sound of the crying in the pits. But the verdict of history was written in the ink of the inquiry and the blood of the creek. The Sand Creek Massacre stood as a testament to what happens when fear is weaponized and humanity is discarded in the name of security. The flag that Black Kettle had raised, the one he had trusted to save his family, was never returned to the government with honor. It remained a symbol of the broken covenant. The final chapter of the Sand Creek story was not written in 1864 or 1865. It continued to be written in the grief of the descendants and the struggle to acknowledge the truth of what happened on that freezing November morning. The sun set on the Colorado Territory, but the shadow of Sand Creek stretched long into the future, a dark stain that no amount of time or snow could ever fully wash away.